The Grand Armée during the period 1805 to 1807 was not only tactically superior to its opponents, but it also showcased a rapidity in strategical movement that was for a time unrivaled. This was not because the French soldier could march any quicker than his fellow European, for he held no physical advantage, and in fact their rates of march were matched by the Austrians in the 1809 campaign on the Danube. Instead, the speed and fluidity of the French armies was the result of other, more logistical factors. The semi-independence and autonomy of the corps system was certainly one of these, but perhaps more important was the structure and operation of the French staff system, particularly that of imperial headquarters. Regardless of all other considerations, the speed, accuracy and flexibility of operations would also often depend upon the quality of each army's staff work. This was an area that had seen great advances during the half-century before 1792, and its principles were fully understood in all the major military establishments of Europe. Whilst Griffith is correct in asserting that most European nations during this period were well aware of the growing importance of staff work, as well as being in the process of building a professionalised general staff, it would be the French and their system that initially proved to be the most effective. Therefore, in the following video, we will discuss the structure of this staff system, breaking down the organisation and operation of imperial headquarters, and discover how it helped to provide the Grande Armée with an edge over its adversaries. To begin with, we must first establish what exactly we mean by the term logistics. For this, we can once again turn to Baron Jomini, a staff officer and one-time member of imperial headquarters. Logistics is the art of moving armies. It comprises the order and details of marches and camps, and of quartering and supplying troops. In a word, it is the execution of strategical and tactical enterprises. Strategy decides where to act. Logistics brings the troops to this point. Grand tactics decides the manner of execution and the employment of the troops. In simple terms, logistics could therefore be described as the means of operating and controlling an army. It is the link between grand tactics and strategy, topics much discussed in the previous video in this series. However, where things begin to complicate is in figuring out what exactly logistics consists of. Originally, as Jomini explains, things were not too difficult. The word logistics is derived from the title of the Major Général de Logis, translated in German by Quartiermeister, an officer whose duty it formerly was to lodge and camp the troops, to give direction to the marches of columns, and to locate them upon the ground. Logistics was then quite simple. The reason that things appear to be relatively simple during earlier times is because armies were, until around the middle of the 18th century, generally seen and utilised as single entities. This meant that the army would remain joined, marching as one, and often maintaining a single line of supply and communication. These factors therefore enabled the operation of such an army to be handled by very few men, and the major decisions such as direction of march, orders of battle, and strategical concerns could be decided by the general or commander-in-chief without much assistance. For most of history, the staff had consisted merely of a few aides-de-camp to carry messages back and forth and to keep the commander informed of events that were happening beyond the range of his personal vision. To these aides had been added over the ages some clerks to keep records, to write and copy orders, and to make and carry maps. Sometimes the commander's staff would include an especially trusted friend or subordinate officer to help him make the difficult decisions. However, by the middle of the 18th century, things began to change. For one, armies which had once been raised only during times of war were beginning to be maintained during peace. The advantages of this practice was better trained and theoretically better motivated soldiers, as shown by Frederick the Great's Prussian army, particularly as infantry. The downside, however, was that maintaining such an army all year round meant more administrative work, which therefore required more staff officers to handle it. Perhaps a bigger factor of change, however, came about as a result of those who had to face the genius of Frederick the Great during battles and campaigns. Struggling to overcome the discipline and training that the Prussians possessed, the Austrians sought a new approach and began to break their own armies into smaller contingents so as to enable a greater flexibility in their actions. The idea was that these smaller parts would march independently before ideally then converging prior to the battle. Instead of a single massed army directly under its general's eye and command, an army became a group of miniature armies, divisions, and under Napoleon, army corps, dispersed over vast areas and seldom brought physically together except on the field of a great battle. The art of war became, in a far more precise way than formerly, an art to be pursued upon the map and offering an infinitely greater number of problems and possibilities than ever before. Having multiple smaller armies, each of whom travelled via a separate route, not only required individual sets of marching orders, but it also meant that supply lines would now be split into multiple directions. As can then be imagined, orchestrating and coordinating the actions of these separate forces, thereby ensuring that they arrived at the correct time and place, became increasingly difficult. This difficulty was only made worse by the fact that most of the top commands in the armies of the old regimes were held by men of high status as opposed to high ability, and whilst they certainly may have been bold and brave leaders of men, it was rare that they understood the professional and technical aspects of controlling an army. Therefore, with multiple armies now only increasing these technical and logistical demands, something had to be done to help them, as Bond explains. The need for a specialist group of men to assist the commanding general was apparent, all the more so as under monarchical regimes high commands were a virtual monopoly of royal princes and the higher nobility, who could safely be relied upon neither to evince outstanding ability nor earnest devotion to professional studies. Staff officers would literally provide the staff upon which such commanders could lean for advice. Quite naturally, therefore, the Austrians, upon dividing their army, simultaneously began to form a general staff of officers who could assist the commander-in-chief in managing these increasingly complicated logistical matters. The Austrians formed their general staff in February 1758, and they very soon showed a greater flexibility and freedom in all of their operations. At Hochkirch, they pioneered a way of attacking by converging columns, and they went on to employ it still more successfully at Maxen, where they took an entire Prussian corps prisoner. Austria was not alone in this way of thinking, and during the second half of the 18th century, many European nations began to look into dividing their armies into smaller components and to also create a form of general staff so as to manage it. To requote Griffith, this was an area that had seen great advances during the half-century before 1792, and its principles were fully understood in all the major military establishments of Europe. Although universally understood, as in many other military matters, it was once again the French, during the second half of the century, who had taken this concept the furthest, mainly thanks to Pierre-Joseph Bourset. Bourset wanted a permanent staff corps of select, specifically trained officers. His proposal was not exactly welcomed by the Royal Army's generals, but in 1783, Minister of War de Segur finally formed a corps d'état-major. Officers chosen for it were to be trained in topography, history, geography, preparation of unit histories, reconnaissance, and the science of the art of war. This idea of specifically trained staff officers is where I want to take a little bit of a sidestep in the narrative, because the professionally trained general staff that Bourset envisioned never quite materialized during the Napoleonic period, although the foundations were certainly laid. Therefore, to show an effective general staff at perhaps the peak of its powers, we must fast forward to 1870 and examine the Prussian general staff during the Franco-Prussian War. I don't want to spend too long here, but I feel it is important to understand how a general staff is supposed to function before we move on to discussing the French system. Despite the myth that the Prussian army of 1806 was still tied entirely to the organisation of Frederick the Great, the years after his death had seen the beginnings of a reorganisation, but there was no change yet strong enough to compete with Napoleon's genius, and defeat at his hands provided a much-needed catalyst. The events of 1806 had demonstrated a need for an improved staff and command system. The King of Prussia therefore authorised a committee to look into both the structure and organisation of the army. The head of this committee was von Scharnhorst, and under his leadership they revolutionised much of the Prussian army, mimicking or expanding upon many of the French ideas in terms of grand and small-scale tactics, but to keep things brief here we will only focus on the changes to the general staff. The general staff, as the reformers visualised it, would be a collection of the best and most experienced minds of the entire army, so organized and dedicated that they could effectively function as a single coordinated brain, but always be fully responsive to the commands and desires of the Commander-in-Chief. To achieve this standard of officers, an education system was put in place, and even then only the best and brightest would be admitted to the General Staff. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, although these reforms were not yet complete, the working relationship between Gneisenau as Chief of Staff and Blücher as Commander-in-Chief would prove how effective such a system could become. However, although Scharnhorst had the initial vision, it would be under Helmuth von Moltke's leadership that the envisioned lofty standards would become a reality. Von Moltke became Chief of the Prussian General Staff in 1857, but he had always been a thinker and philosopher of warfare, noting in particular the changes that the Napoleonic period had brought about. He could see that war was becoming a far more complex affair, and that improvising an operation, as Napoleon had done in the weeks before Jena, was no longer possible. Detailed planning had now become the key. After 1857, he expanded the Prussian General Staff and vastly extended its influence, using it for systematic peacetime and war planning. To ensure and maintain both the quality and mental fitness of this staff, von Moltke, during peacetime, would run war games and field exercises, both of which were umpired by senior officers, before the results and actions were then assessed and analysed by the entire staff. This training also helped to instill an esprit de corps within the staff, as well as to unify their thinking on military matters. Once war broke out, however, von Moltke would personally move closer to the front alongside a condensed form of the General Staff, perhaps no more than 20 men, but always including his most trusted senior aides. Podbielski, Bronsart, Brandenstein, Verdi and Blum were for General von Moltke not only precious auxiliaries, but veritable collaborators. Each of these aides had a specific task and area of focus within the General Staff, and the remaining officers would act as assistants, their number varying with the requirements of each department. General von Podbielski, Quartermaster General entrusted with details and second-in-command to von Moltke. Lieutenant Colonel Bronsart von Schellendorf, charged with operations. Lieutenant Colonel von Brandenstein, conveyance of marches. Lieutenant Colonel Verdi du Venois, head of information concerning the French army. Major Blum, tasked with the drawing up and transmission of orders. This is not too different from a modern staff system, although time and experience has improved the clarity between the roles of each department. I have been unable to find a consensus upon the exact titles within a modern system, and perhaps it differs per nation, but generally they are organised as follows. G1, Personnel and Administration. G2, Intelligence and Counterintelligence. G3, Plans and Operations. G4, Supply and Logistics. G5, Military Government. No matter the ordering, the key to a successful General Staff was not only clarity in roles, but also in the collaboration and interaction between these various departments, and von Moltke, as Chief of Staff, ensured exactly this in his own system, bringing his senior aides as the heads of the departments together as a form of brain trust to discuss events and plan strategies. When an important dispatch arrived in the middle of the night, the council immediately met at General von Moltke's, and decisions ensued from the examination together of the situation. The work, Verdi tells us, was arranged as follows. We met each morning at General von Moltke's to study the situation and the steps which it called for. Following this meeting, General von Moltke submitted to King William his proposals as well as the means of execution. As you can see, it was very much a collaboration of minds, and acting as their chief, von Moltke was then able to present King William, the Commander-in-Chief, with all that he needed, requiring from him only a decision upon which course of operations to take. Perhaps this Prussian system is an extreme example, because William was not a particularly military-minded monarch in the same way as a Frederick or a Napoleon, but if we use Fouché's description of a modern general staff, we can see how von Moltke's staff very much operated within this mould. In modern armies, the staff is the service whose mission it is to formulate and to transmit the wishes of the Commander-in-Chief, but this is only part of its role. Another part, and not the least important, is to collect, group, and submit to the Commander-in-Chief in a concrete form the information of all sorts which serves as a basis for his decision. The staff also works in close collaboration with the Commander-in-Chief, who remains, however, entirely responsible for the decisions to come. This idea of a more complete general staff is important to keep in mind, and in returning to our narrative, I can imagine that Berthier would very much have enjoyed being in the position of von Moltke, but unfortunately his own dream setup was to be quickly scuppered. Despite the establishment of a corps d'état-major, essentially a general staff as well as a form of staff officer training in 1783, the revolution 6 years later disbanded this organisation. As usual, the threat of war brought back the realisation that perhaps they were too quick in destroying everything of royal origin, and that maybe a form of staff system would be required in order to handle a divisional system, as well as the multitude of armies needed to fight on the various fronts. Accordingly, in 1790, the government set up a system of adjudants généraux, supposedly picked officers capable of handling basic staff functions. Their number was repeatedly increased, reaching 110 during 1799 to 1800. Also in 1792, each army was given a chef d'état-major. He was to have 4 adjudants généraux as assistants, each of whom was to be aided by several officiers adjoints of his own choice, taken from combat units. Every division, advance guard and large reserve was to have an adjutant general as its chief of staff. The idea of each division and eventually demi-brigade having its own miniature staff setup with a chief of staff, assistants, and most importantly attached officers from each of the combat units was very forward-thinking, and is a practice that is continued today. It essentially enabled smooth communication up and down the command tree, and by taking care of logistical and administrative matters, enabled the combat officers to operate more effectively. The divisional staff officers were responsible for replicating the work of the army staff but on a smaller scale, sending reports upwards and orders downwards, while collecting orders from above and reports from below. Whilst this system was a step in the right direction, and would continue into the Grande Armée, during the early revolutionary years it wasn't without issues. The first was that many of the members of the disbanded corps d'état-major who would have been perfect fits into some of these chief of staff or adjutant roles were disqualified because of the perceived royalist associations with such an organisation. Therefore, many of the officers actually placed into these various staff positions lacked the training required for such a role, and perhaps worse, many of them had been promoted via deeds on the battlefield, which whilst impressive, showcased bravery rather than brainpower. Although there were certainly exceptions, generally these men frequently lacked the administrative know-how to completely handle such roles, and as a consequence many of the early revolutionary armies were plagued by a lack of efficient staff work, despite the promise of the system. Another problem came from potential interference from outside sources, namely the successive regimes that took political power. Each would often replace staff members or generals, no matter how capable, simply because they were put in place by or held ties to the previous administration. Worse were the deputies, sent by the Directory to supposedly oversee and supervise the army, ensuring its loyalty to the Republic. Unfortunately, they often lacked military experience and know-how, and might therefore interfere with an already working system for lack of understanding. They also brought the threat of the guillotine along with them, a notion which only helped to restrict ideas and developments from taking place. Finally, even if a competent army staff system could be established, without written guidelines there was no standard way of working, and each commander seemed to have his own preferences for how things were to be done. Worse was that commanders and chiefs of staff were regularly switched between staff and field work, as well as between armies, making it difficult to even attempt to establish any real consistency, and new officers simply had to learn on the job. Fortunately for the French, they did have two things going for them. The first was that their opponents were no closer to establishing a competent staff system of their own, for despite the Austrians proving fairly proficient during this time, even helping the Russians at various points, the limited organisation of their own armies consistently hampered their staff work. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, there were a few French officers who were at least trying to improve things. One of these men had in fact been a part of the Corps d'État-Major, working and studying under Berthier. He was a short and jolly man called Louis-Alexandre Berthier. Despite high middle-class roots and an association with an organisation removed by the Revolution, it seems that Berthier's competence and skillful handling of administrative matters bypassed any potential concerns, and from 1794 onwards he found his services in frequent demand. He served as Chief of Staff to several armies and commanders, and by the summer of 1795 he was serving as Chief of Staff to the Army of the Alps under General Kellerman, and it was here that he penned a document that would form the foundation for the French system moving forward. In this document, published the 21st of January 1796, entitled Document sur le service de l'État-Major général à l'Armée des Alpes, Berthier essentially wrote up regulations and instructions for the general staff of the army. In this, he split the staff into 4 departments, each dealing with different aspects and each headed by an adjutant general, with himself as the chief of staff overseeing them all. The first of these departments was to deal with keeping staff records, unit strengths, movements, organisation, inspections, military law, deserters, prisons of war and requisition labour. The second department managed the official journal, armament, artillery, engineers, subsistence, hospitals and police. The third covered reconnaissance, plans, communications and outposts, while the fourth was for administration and housekeeping of the entire headquarters, covering such things as billeting the HQ, finding its supplies of forage and food, as well as overseeing some of the more routine work done at headquarters. In some ways, you can sort of put the modern labels on these departments, with the first being similar to G3, plans and operations, the second, G4, concerned with supply and logistics, the third is obviously close to G2, intelligence and counterintelligence, while the fourth resembles G1, personnel and logistics. Some fit better than others, and Berthier's system, as to be expected, lacks much of the clarity of the modern system, which has been tested and improved. Regardless, it was another step in the right direction, and as we will see, the organisation laid out here would form the foundations for imperial headquarters. It should be said that Berthier was not the only capable staff officer of the revolutionary period, for as the wars continued, the system naturally began to place those of competence and ability into the right places, and names such as Dessay, Rainier, Soult, Suchet, Sancerre, and many more all at certain points excelled as chiefs of staff for various armies, and would of course go on to make names for themselves under the Empire. However, none of them, besides Soult very briefly in 1815, were ever chief of staff to Napoleon, and once he became head of state and consequently began to shape the army into his own ideal, it was his methods, and by association Berthier's ideas and organisational practices, that became the norm under the Empire, especially once imperial headquarters was established. Ironically, however, Berthier was not actually Napoleon's first choice for chief of staff when he became commander-in-chief of the Army of Italy in 1796. Napoleon took Berthier as his chief of staff only after his first choice, a General Duvigneau, now forgotten, refused the assignment. Prior to being given command in Italy, Napoleon had been in charge of the Army of the Interior, where General Duvigneau had been his chief of staff. Naturally, therefore, Napoleon offered him the same job in Italy, but, seeing little chance for promotion or recognition in such a neglected theatre and under the command of an inexperienced commander, Duvigneau refused, preferring to remain in the comforts of Paris. Unfortunately for him, history would show him to be wrong, and Berthier would prove to be a more than adequate replacement. Upon taking up his new position, Berthier altered the Army of Italy's general staff to mimic the blueprint that he had established during his tenure with the Army of the Alps, though almost immediately Napoleon began to add his own touches and shape it to fit his own needs, a sign of things to come for imperial headquarters. The Bureau of Secret Affairs, set up by Bonaparte after the Battle of Lodi under General Kilmaine and his sinister assistant Landrieu. This was a mixture of an espionage centre, a secret police HQ, and a civilian affairs or G5 bureau. Its role was to compile police files on the occupied populations of Italy and on the officers of the French army itself. It supervised internal security, while the adjutant general charged with intelligence tried to follow the enemy's military activities. Perhaps more famously were the guides that Napoleon made a part of his headquarters for personal protection. The revolutionary governments had already authorised a small company of guides to protect generals when on reconnaissance and in the field, but after the ones assigned to the army in Italy proved inadequate, resulting in Napoleon almost being captured, he took matters into his own hands. A few days later, he had a larger and different set of guides, a company of 200 daredevils, well-mounted, brave, picked men and horses under a captain Jean Berthier, famous for courage, leadership and discipline. This company would eventually be expanded, becoming the chasseurs cheval of the Imperial Guard, and their commander would ascend to the rank of marshal. Although they eventually became of regimental strength and would see much action upon the battlefields of Europe, they would also retain their duty of protectors to the Emperor, forming part of the duty squadron and personal escort. Napoleon's own acknowledgement and appreciation of their service is shown by his most frequent attire, the uniform of a colonel of their regiment. It is difficult to pin down the exact layout of Grand Quartier Général Impérial, because as Napoleon's power and political influence grew, not only did the size and number of armies under his command increase, but his dynastic responsibilities meant that during campaigns, imperial headquarters was no longer just the command centre of the army, but of the entire empire. These factors meant that throughout its lifespan, it was therefore constantly evolving, not only to account for the increasing responsibility, but also as both Napoleon and Berthier made adjustments to improve its operation. The complete structure and function of imperial headquarters, with its mix of political and military functionaries, is probably worthy of a video of its own, but to keep things grounded here, I will instead only focus on the elements relevant to the Grande Armée during our period. As a side note, although some authors tend to combine and include the issue of supplies under the blanket term logistics, I have decided to deal with them in a separate video, as including them in earlier drafts here just felt like a massive side tangent. This is not to say that supplies are not logistical concerns, they absolutely are, for soldiers cannot optimally function when poorly supplied, but I am viewing logistics here more as the mechanisms of operating the army as opposed to the requirements, and I would consider supplies to come under the latter. Therefore, they will get their own video. But, to return to the topic, imperial headquarters was essentially split into three main areas: Napoleon's household, army general headquarters, and l'intendance, or administration, the latter of which dealt mainly with the issue of supply. Therefore, our focus here will chiefly be on the first two sections. Napoleon's household was unsurprisingly headed by him, and was split into three sections: the Maison Civile, the Maison Militaire, and Napoleon's personal cabinet. The first of these, the Maison Civile, or civilian household, comprised such characters as Caulaincourt and Doreau, and it was generally concerned with the personal safety and well-being of the emperor. It handles such seemingly trivial but extremely important matters as his travel arrangements, his meals, sleeping arrangements, his horses and carriages, as well as his equipment when on campaign. Given the eccentric and tireless nature of Napoleon, the members of this household had a tricky job, and always had to be ready to move out or to act at a moment's notice. The various campaign theatres, particularly in Poland and Russia, also meant that they had to establish Napoleon's palace, as the place where he slept was always referred to, in a variety of places, from barns to castles. However, in our context here regarding the civilian household's impact upon La Grande Armée, their importance lay simply in the fact that they removed much of the need to worry about trivial tasks from Napoleon. If he wanted to eat, his food was ready. If he needed sleep, then his camp bed would be there. If he needed a horse, then one was always kept at the ready. This all enabled Napoleon to free up his mind and to therefore focus his brain power on much more important tasks that generally only he could do. In contrast, the Maison Militaire, or military household, was very much a part of La Grande Armée. The main occupants were the imperial aides-de-camp, who were a set of soldiers hand-picked by Napoleon, each of whom usually specialised in a particular branch of the army. For example, consulting the order of battle for the 1st of April 1807, just prior to the commencement of the campaign that would conclude at Friedland, the imperial aides-de-camp present at imperial headquarters were listed as follows: General Lemeroy, a logistics specialist and master organizer; General Savary, a light cavalryman and expert in reconnaissance and intelligence, and who would later replace Fouché as Minister of Police; General Rapp, a bold and brave cavalry commander who famously led the light cavalry of the Imperial Guard into Battle of Austerlitz, where he captured a Russian prince. General Bertrand was an engineer known for his hard work and efficiency, and who would later replace Duroc as Grand Marshal of the Palace and accompany Napoleon into exile on both Elba and St. Helena. General Lebrun was another cavalryman, particularly apt at handling both light and heavy cavalry with equal competence. General Mouton, later to be better known as Count Lebeau, was a tall, strong and tough commander of infantry. And finally, General Riel was another infantry commander who began his military life as a grenadier. Despite their specializations, these men were not merely one-trick ponies, and could, and often were, be trusted to handle independent missions or lead combined arms forces into battle. For example, the previous year, after the Battle of Jena, Lemeroy was made governor of Wittenberg, and during the Eylau campaign, Savary was given temporary command of 5th Corps, its usual commander, Marshal Lannes, absent with illness. Savary performed well, leading the corps to victory over the Russians at Ostrolenka, a perhaps bright spark in an otherwise bleak winter campaign for the Grande Armée. Perhaps most famously of the aides mentioned, however, were Riel and Mouton, who would each command a corps during the Waterloo campaign in 1815. Therefore, these aides were extremely competent and essentially became Napoleon's go-to men when on campaign. They were men for all missions, leading improvised task forces to meet unexpected emergencies, massing artillery to support a decisive attack, clearing a snarled supply line, conducting large-scale reconnaissances, and sometimes handling minor diplomatic assignments. They had authority to require even marshals to hold reviews and showdown inspections so that they might examine the state of their troops. They were loyal but not courtiers. They spoke the truth as they saw it and did not flatter. Napoleon gave them his trust, accepted their frankest advice and comments without rancour, if not without occasional anger, and counted them as friends. Interestingly, although these aides held both the word of the emperor and the means to overrule a marshal, they were not always of the highest rank. To take our example above, Lemeroy, Savary, Rapp and Riel were generals of division, whilst Mouton, Lebrun and Bertrand were only generals of brigade. Despite this variation, these men would each possess their own aide-de-camp, who Napoleon frequently made use of, either for much smaller assignments or most commonly as battlefield messengers. This requirement of borrowing aides led Napoleon to expand his military household with the creation of the Officers d'Ordonnance in 1806, as Pauly explains. In 1805-06, the emperor had borrowed orderly officers from Berthier for his own employment. Napoleon was a man of habit, however, and disliked seeing new faces around him all the time. He therefore decided to create his own corps of orderly officers. Possessing the rank of captain or lieutenant, and again selected from all arms, their number was limited to 12, though rarely were all of them present at headquarters. They were to carry orders, survey the land, report back on troop strength or morale, and essentially act as an extension to Napoleon's eyes and ears. He famously commented in an order to one of these officers that he wanted the report back to be in such detail that he could believe that he had been there himself and seen it with his own eyes. Strangely, despite their duties clearly being of a strict military nature, in 1809 these orderly officers were placed under the authority of Caulaincourt, which would therefore make them a part of the civilian household. However, for our period they were very much seen as part of the military household, in keeping with their role. The final part of Napoleon's maison was his personal cabinet, again split into 3 divisions. The first, the Secretariat, as its name suggests, contained Napoleon's secretaries, charged with taking dictation and ensuring that his signature was on all orders and letters that he dictated. During our period, the main secretary was Claude Meneval, but Agathon Jean-François Fain was added in 1806 as archivist, though essentially acted as a secondary secretary. Given Napoleon's boundless energy, peculiar sleep patterns and constant flow of ideas, these secretaries were kept extremely busy, with at least one of them always expected to be ready to take dictation day or night. Meneval and Fain lived so retired a life that there were chamberlains who, after having served 4 years in the palace, had never seen them. A general clerk was also part of this section, holding the title Secretariat du Cabinet. However, his role is kind of ambiguous. He would be partly responsible for the topographical bureau and partly for the correspondence concerning plans of operations and with the different administrations. It seems that he was sort of an overseer of the operations within the cabinet, but at times on campaign he was also made temporary governor in several captured cities. Therefore it is difficult to conclude how important his role was in the smooth running of the cabinet. In 1807 he would in fact replace Berthier as Minister of War, a role he maintained until 1814, though during the latter years Elting notes that Napoleon grew increasingly dissatisfied with his services. The second division, the Bureau de Renseignement, was based upon the Bureau of Secret Affairs established by Napoleon in the Army of Italy, though here its primary concern was military intelligence. During our period it was actually run by one of the imperial aides-de-camp, General Savary, who as you may recall would later become Chief of Police, and was therefore perfectly suited for the role. This division would employ spies and informants, as well as interrogate prisoners, or frequently go out and conduct their own short and long-range reconnaissance missions. They would report to Napoleon, but their findings would also be passed on to Berthier and the main general staff. The final division was perhaps the most important, or at least it was one of Napoleon's favourites, and that was the Bureau Topographique de l'Empereur. His Bureau Topographique was of such importance that it always followed him wherever he went, installed in offices in his palaces or in a tent next to his own when on campaign. Barclay de Albe, a man known to Napoleon since Toulon, was, despite possessing the rank of only chef de la squadron, made head of this department in 1804, a role he maintained until 1814. His job was to acquire maps of the campaign areas, or simply create them using topographical information gathered by trained artillery or engineer officers. Crucially, de Albe would also update Napoleon's situational map, usually the largest map of the current campaign area, in which pins were placed denoting the known location of both friendly and enemy forces. As we will see later, this map was key in Napoleon's strategical thinking, and it is said that de Albe was the first person Napoleon asked for when arriving at headquarters, and the last person he spoke to before leaving. Returning to Imperial headquarters, the other section to talk about was the Grand État-Major Général, or the Army General Headquarters, and this was of course Berthier's domain, and was again split into three main departments. Its core was his cabinet, a small knot of experienced men, mostly officers retired because of wounds, or civilians, hard workers and devoted to Berthier, who looked after them. They were expected to show initiative and be ready at all times. As Elting says, the first section, and in many ways the heart of army headquarters, was the Bureau du Major Général, better known as Berthier's cabinet. It was composed of a dozen individuals, almost all of them technically civilians, although several had been in the army. They were all bound and loyal to Berthier, seemingly working for nothing more than praise and job satisfaction, and he in turn treated them exceptionally well. Napoleon was aware of their quality, and was said to also be quite fond of them, frequently visiting the officers, and in the words of one of the members, never left without showing a kindness to one of us. They were hard-working, and included Berthier's two personal secretaries, Le Duc, who handled private correspondence and safeguarded the cabinet archives and safe, and de Fresne, head of bookkeeping and interior administration within the cabinet. Perhaps most importantly for the army was a retired captain, affectionately known as Father Salamon. Monsieur Salamon saw to the movement of troops, a duty which he carried out in the office of the Chief of Staff during all campaigns from 1805 to 1814. The correspondence through the channel of the Chief of Staff was the essence of the organisation of the Grand Armée. With the aid of a few employees, the indefatigable Salamon attended to the whole of this work. Clearly Salamon was an extremely important figure, and it is a shame that, at least from my reading, so little is written about a man who helped to organise some of the great strategical manoeuvres of the Grande Armée. Salamon was noted for being almost as enduring as Berthier, and another walking encyclopedia on army organisation. Because Berthier was also Minister of War during our period being discussed, his cabinet therefore also contained a section that dealt with the movement of troops within the interior of France. However, when he gave up this dual role in 1807, this department was also removed. Within the cabinet was also a section which handled intelligence, and for much of our period it was headed by a Colonel Blind, but Pauly suggests that this officer of engineers, after working for the cabinet during 1806–07, soon returned to corps level where he was a chief of staff. Whoever was in charge, this department handled and organised all of the reconnaissance and patrol reports, as well as the information garnered from spies, prisoners of war, civilians and deserters, all from corps level. Much of the information that d'Albe used to update Napoleon's master map was inherited from this department. Finally, there was also a section which updated the army's muster rolls, which would have been based upon the corps' daily strength returns, which will be touched on later. The next part of the Grand État-Major Général was the État-Major Particulier, sometimes referred to as Berthier's private military staff. Split into two parts, the first was almost in mimicry of Napoleon's imperial aide-de-camp, though they never held an official title as far as I can tell. They were a select group of high-ranking officers, loyal to Berthier, who could be trusted with special missions which required officers of such rank, be them diplomatic or military. These men were hand-picked by Berthier, and whilst most of them were competent in a variety of roles, he was also prone to picking several officers with more specific skill sets and specializations, usually dependent upon the necessities of the campaign at hand. For example, in 1805, Berthier even had with him a naval capitaine de frégate to advise on navigation of the Danube and a director of telegraphs. In addition, although never officially recognized as part of this military staff, Berthier also frequently attached to it various foreign officers who functioned as liaisons between their allied units and/or courts. Highly prized amongst these were the Polish officers who, according to Elting, had the reputation for unusual skill at languages and the ability to make themselves understood anywhere. Also, most of them were fine horsemen, capable of making a deep reconnaissance behind the enemy's lines, passing themselves off as Prussians, Austrians or Russians. The other part of this military staff was perhaps the most eye-catching in the entire army, famous for their splendid uniforms, particularly the scarlet trousers that Berthier insisted that they wore. They were officially known as Berthier's personal aide-de-camp, and in 1805 they numbered just 6, but by 1807 they had increased to 13. They held ranks varying from lieutenant to colonel, though when promoted to higher than colonel they would be found a new vocation. However, whilst a part of imperial headquarters, they were frequently referred to as the enfants terribles. They were again hand-picked by Berthier, but this time not for their ability, but because of either special favours or aristocratic links, be them French or foreign. Examples included the son of Berthier's long-time love interest, Madame Visconti, as well as the brother of Napoleon's Polish mistress, Madame Walewska. They were all hard drinkers and gamblers, and Napoleon particularly disliked both them and their attitude. Despite this, they were still useful members of the staff. Hard drinkers, gamblers, duellists, rakes, great turners up of petticoats, daredevils and heartbreakers, always in debt, insufferable, but who always arrived where they intended to arrive, never got lost, knew how to speak proudly and firmly, even to marshals. A message entrusted to them was always delivered, neither obstacles nor man stopped them. The final part of Grand État-Major Général was the largest, and that was the État-Major Général, or the General Staff proper. It was itself divided into 3 divisions, each of which was commanded by an assistant major general. However, the commander of the first and largest division was seen as senior and also held the title Chief of the Army Staff. He not only oversaw most of the entire operation of this general staff, but he was also the one in main direct communication with Berthier through written orders. During our period, this Chief of the Army Staff was General Andriossi in 1805, then General Lecamus replaced him in 1806, and finally General Panatier took over the role in 1807. I don't know why this position saw such a fast turnover. I couldn't actually find a direct answer, and I'm half convinced they switched it just to confuse me 200 years later and trying to understand it all. Anyway, as stated, this first division was the largest and was split into several officers, 3 initially in 1805, but 2 more had been added by the end of 1807. The first of these officers handled troop movements, orders of the day, passwords, officer assignments, and general correspondence. The second office concerned itself with the quarters of the general staff, police duties, gendarmerie, supplies for the staff, and hospitals. The third office covered prisoners of war, deserters, conscripts, requisitioning, councils of war, and the law and order of military government. During La Grande Armée's advance into Poland in late 1806, Berthier felt compelled to create a fourth office for both the management and security of the army's lengthening lines of communication. Its members were to keep tabs on the various depots, ensure accommodation for replacements along this route, whilst also maintaining a flow of correspondence throughout this line back to France. Finally, in 1807, a fifth office was added for correspondence with fortress commanders, headquarters troops, and the wagon master general. The second division within this general staff was headed throughout our period by General Dumas, who also held the title Quartermaster General, and to get an idea of his role we can actually see the letter that Berthier wrote to him, informing him of his assignment on the 1st of September 1805. I beg to inform you, General, that the Emperor has chosen you for employment on the General Staff of the Grand Army, immediately under my orders as Chief of the Staff, and with the title Assistant Chief of the Staff, Quartermaster of the Army. Camps, marches, and cantonments will be entrusted to you. Under your orders will be an Adjutant Major and 4 assistants. I have ordered that each General-in-Chief commanding an army corps shall appoint in his army an Adjutant Major charged exclusively with the same duties of those entrusted to you on the General Staff. These officers will correspond direct with you, receive your instructions, and be responsible to you. I beg to remain with the highest regard, Marshal Berthier. The job of Quartermaster General, involving the camps, marches, and cantonments, very much harkens back to the origins of the role, and in a second letter sent a little later into the campaign, we find Berthier asking Dumas to help ease the movement of La Grande Armée as it moves into Bavaria. I beg you, General, to find me immediately a route for Marshal Murat, who is leaving Stuttgart for Göttingen. See if that can be done in a day's march. Find me a route for Marshal Ney from Stuttgart to Heidenheim via Esslingen, Göppingen, and Weissenstein, leaving on the 12th and arriving on the 15th. Trace another route for Marshal Lannes from Ludwigsburg to Ehlen via Schorndorf and Gmund, leaving on the 12th and arriving on the 16th. Mark on the map, in accordance with your knowledge of the country, the day's marches. I desire General Dumas to hand me this work in half an hour. Whilst this specific job would have been done over a map in headquarters, Berthier notes that Dumas also spent much time in the saddle, riding along these routes and most likely placing himself at key junctions to ensure that the troops travelled in the correct directions. The third and final division of the General Staff was the Service Topographique and was supervised by General Sanson. Under him worked 10 officers and geographical engineers, who were tasked with updating the situational maps within the General Staff. However, during this period in history, maps were not always accurate, nor even available for certain regions, and therefore Sanson would organise topographical reconnaissances using his own staff, often complemented with trained artillerymen, to sketch out uncharted areas and create maps for use with the army. The information gathered by Sanson and his men was also handed to Napoleon's personal topographic section within his cabinet, and it seems that information was passed both ways. All important maps and reports for the Emperor's topographical office were duplicated so that General Sanson would have copies. The requirement of creating maps is why attached to this third division was a small printing press who could then make duplicate copies of these maps for use within the army. This work was done by the tiny Service de l'Imprimerie, a director and 8 men, which moved with the headquarters and could produce hundreds of such maps in just a few hours. This printing press was also responsible for printing orders of the day, as well as the famous army bulletins which were passed around the army. One last part of the État-Major Général was its pool of officers à la suite, awaiting assignment. Those officers were used to fill vacancies caused by casualties or promotions, to serve as commanders and staff officers for the new fortified bases established along the line of communications as the army advanced, or for special commands or missions. A certain number of such officers always accompanied the army. Others were recovering from wounds or sickness, or were called forward from France as the campaign developed. Normally this pool was established at some major forward base, and individual officers were summoned as needed. As you can see, the État-major général with its organisation into divisions, each with set tasks, is the closest to the idea of a modern general staff, though when you begin to consider imperial headquarters as a whole, then it is clear that there is a lot of overlap, and no clear specificity of tasks, particularly in areas such as topography and troop movements, where it simply isn't immediately clear who is doing what. The issue of troop movements was particularly something that bugged me during my research. In the previous sections you can see that both Father Salomon, as part of Berthier's cabinet, as well as the first office of the 1st Division of the General Staff, are both listed as handling troop movements. But who was actually doing what? Or was it a shared responsibility between them? And if so, how was it organised? Unfortunately, I couldn't find any direct answers to these questions for our period, but I do think that we can almost work it out using information from a few other areas, along with a little logical reasoning. Given the size of imperial headquarters, which in 1806 was about 800 people, when on campaign, Napoleon and Berthier would move ahead of the main party with a much smaller, concentrated group, sometimes referred to as the Petit Quartier Général. This would contain only key personnel, and although I couldn't find an exact list of who it involved, for Napoleon it seems that this party would usually consist of his military household and cabinet, along with only the essential members of his civilian household, such as Caulaincourt, Darreau, Roustam, Yvan, etc. For Berthier, I therefore imagine that it was very similar, and he would take forward perhaps his aides, along with some of the attached officers, as well as most importantly, his cabinet. The remainder of imperial headquarters, including the entirety of the État-major général, or the General Staff proper, would therefore remain behind as part of the rear echelon of the army, perhaps a day or two's march behind the front lines. Therefore, with this setup, it would make sense that all troop movements involving the main army corps would be handled by Salomon and his assistants inside Berthier's cabinet, as these were closest to the front. The troop movement office within the General Staff, being behind the front lines, would therefore handle the movement of troops outside of the main army, such as reserve corps, replacements, depots, etc. I have not come across full proof of this unfortunately, but it does align with the changes made by Berthier after our period to try and undo much of these role overlaps, as well as to just simplify the operation of the General Staff. Around 1809, Berthier simplified matters, employing only one Assistant Chief of Staff, General Joseph Bailly de Monthion. All responsibilities for the preparation and dispatch of orders, intelligence, and personal records were concentrated in the cabinet. Monthion functioned as headquarters commandant, controlling its movements and housekeeping, and the movements of minor units not attached to any of the corps. His staff of adjutant commandants handled such minor records and reports as did not go to the cabinet, line of communications matters, and prisoner of war escorts and guards. Although these changes certainly improved things, they were not present during our period, and even if they were, imperial headquarters was still far from perfect. Compared to our modern staff system, the Grand Quartier Général Impérial seems haphazardly organised, lacking the definite division of staff responsibilities into our familiar G1, G2, G3, G4 and G5. Given its haphazard nature, it is easy to question how it actually functioned, and how was it as efficient as I claimed in the introduction, and better than anything that other European nations could muster. However, imperial headquarters was never supposed to function as modern staff systems do, as even the general staff section of it was merely a tool, as Pauli observes. The État-major général was organised to allow Marshal Berthier to cope with any problem arising during a campaign, and to provide the Emperor with the most minute information on the army, its allies, and its enemies. That last line is key because imperial headquarters had one distinctive feature that no other system could boast, and it was both its biggest strength as well as a clear weakness. That factor was Napoleon. The entire infrastructure of imperial headquarters was designed and built merely to facilitate the emperor and his method of making war. Any role overlaps were cleared by the simple fact that everything was centralized through him. All major as well as a significant number of minor decisions were made by Napoleon and Napoleon alone. The staff in no way participated in the emperor's intellectual work. It was never taken into his confidence. It had but to obey scrupulously. The Emperor alone gave movement, he alone directed all the departments. Confine yourselves strictly to the orders which I shall be sending you. Execute my instructions punctually. Everyone must hold themselves in readiness and stay at their posts. Only I alone know what I must do. This meant that the staff's purpose was merely to present Napoleon with the relevant information so as to allow him to then make the necessary decisions. In military terms, this meant that they would present reconnaissance reports, update his maps, provide up-to-date information on the strength and morale of his troops, as well as that of the enemy, report on the state of roads, of ammunition, supplies, etc., etc., etc. All of this information was then processed by Napoleon, and once he came to a decision, the staff's role was then to take down the orders, write out the required number of copies, and then disseminate them through the chain of command to the appropriate units who would then carry them out. Whilst von Moltke would hold daily staff meetings to discuss events and plans with his close-knit collaborators, Napoleon famously only ever held one council of war, that being on the retreat from Moscow, which resulted in the decision to turn back upon the original northern route by which the army came. At all other times, Napoleon was his own council, and imperial headquarters was merely a tool, purpose-built for his use. In no sense was it a collaboration. None of this is to say that Napoleon never asked his staff, officers, marshals, or even his soldiers for their opinions on matters. There are plenty of examples of this taking place, but the key point is that he never sought their advice on what to do, merely their opinions, which to Napoleon were simply pieces of information for use in his own calculations. This is also where a certain level of misunderstanding tends to creep in surrounding Berthier, because although he bore the title Chief of Staff, he did not function in this role in anything like the capacity of what we now understand it to be. I am nothing in the army. I receive the marshal's reports in the name of the Emperor, and I sign his orders for him. In most setups, the Commander-in-Chief would come to a decision, and then the staff, headed by the Chief of Staff, would work out the logistical details of putting these plans into action. We see this in the example of the Prussian General Staff in 1870, where the Commander-in-Chief, King William, merely had to decide upon which course of action to take. The logistical means of carrying out this action, as in the orders of march, the routes to be taken, the timings, etc., were all worked out by von Moltke and his General Staff. Napoleon, however, was different, for although he was the Commander-in-Chief, he was also effectively his own Chief of Staff, for his orders would contain not just the ideas, but very often the means for carrying them out. To show an example of this, we will now analyse one of Napoleon's orders from the Jena campaign in 1806. I am not sure who took dictation, but the order is addressed to Berthier as the Chief of the Staff. It is dated 4 AM, October the 12th, 1806, which puts it 2 days prior to the Battle of Jena, and its contents allude to the grand pivot upon its left which the entire Grand Army undertook prior to the battle. Give orders to Marshal Davout to leave his position for Naumburg, where he must arrive as quickly as possible, but always holding his troops ready to fight. He will be preceded by all his light cavalry, which will send out skirmishers as far as possible, as much for the purpose of obtaining news of the enemy as to make prisoners, stop baggage, and get accurate information. General Sahu's division of dragoons will be under his orders. It will proceed to Mittelpolnitz, where it will receive Marshal Davout's orders. Prince Murat and Marshal Bernadotte are also ordered to Naumburg, but are to follow the Zeitz road. Marshal Lannes proceeds from Neustadt to Jena. Marshal Augereau proceeds to Calle. Marshal Ney will be at Mittelpolnitz. Headquarters will be at Gera, noon. Give orders for the sending off of the divisions of heavy cavalry and the divisions of dragoons which have remained in the rear, as well as the park of artillery, to Gera. As you can see, this order contains instructions for various corps and commanders on what their daily march destinations are to be. For the most part, things are bare bones, and some commanders are designated no more than their destination, but for others there are more details. Davout, for example, is given advice on how to move and what he is to do as regards reconnaissance and interception of the enemy. Both Murat and Bernadotte are also given a route to go with their destination, so as to avoid a collision with Davout, who was also heading to Naumburg. As stated, this order was for Berthier, with the purpose being that he would then use its contents to write out the full orders for each individual commander. If we take a look at the one for Davout, we can see what this looked like, This was dated just an hour later, again at Ulm, the location of Imperial headquarters. Marshal Davout is ordered with the whole of his army corps to leave the position he occupies and proceed direct to Naumburg, but always holding his troops ready to fight. He will be preceded by all his light cavalry, which will send out skirmishers as far as possible, as much for the purpose of obtaining news of the enemy as to make prisoners, stop baggage, and get accurate information. General Sahu's division of dragoons will be under Marshal Davout's orders. I beg to inform Marshal Davout that I am instructing General Sahu to proceed to Mittel, where he will receive the Marshal's orders. The Grand Duke of Berg and Marshal Bernadotte are also ordered to proceed to Naumburg, but to follow the Zeitz road. Marshal Lannes proceeds toward Jena from Neustadt. Marshal Augereau proceeds to Calle, Marshal Soult to Gera, and Marshal Ney to Mittel. Imperial headquarters will be today at noon at Gera. Here you can clearly see that Berthier has used the contents of the initial order to write out a more complete and specific order for Davout to follow. The details regarding the Marshal's march to Naumburg are in fact copied almost word for word from the original, whilst the other details, involving the placement of Sahu's dragoon division under his command, as well as the general movements of the other corps, are fleshed out to be made more relevant specifically to Davout. Importantly though, almost all of the information given here is present in the original order. Considering that Napoleon's instructions for Davout were the most in-depth, let us instead look at what orders Marshal Murat received from Imperial headquarters. The Emperor orders, mon prince, that you leave Gera immediately for Zeitz and send out skirmishers in the direction of Leipzig. It is the Emperor's wish that from Zeitz, if the information you receive shows that the enemy is still near Erfurt, you should proceed to Naumburg, where Marshal Davout will be. Headquarters will be today at Gera. The position of the army today, the 12th, is as follows: Marshal Soult at Gera, Marshal Ney at Mittel, Marshal Lannes at Jena, Marshal Augereau at Calle, and Marshal Davout en route from Mittel to Naumburg. This has a lot more information than a single line in Napoleon's initial general order, which simply read, Prince Murat and Marshal Bernadotte are also ordered to Naumburg, but are to follow the Zeitz road. Now Murat is given instructions on reconnaissance, as well as advice on what to do should the enemy be in a certain location. He is also told the position of the other corps of the army. Therefore, if we were to stop our analysis here, then it would be very tempting to conclude that, given the vague nature of many elements in the original order dictated by Napoleon, compared to these more complete orders from the Chief of Staff, that it was in fact Berthier who was doing much of the work in fleshing out the specifics for the movements of the army, essentially acting exactly as a regular Chief of Staff would do. A common myth in fact runs along similar lines, the idea being that Berthier's importance lay in his ability to interpret, and in a sense translate, Napoleon's sometimes vague or incomplete ideas into a more accessible and comprehensive form. The problem with this idea is that Jomini, who was actually attached to Imperial headquarters during this 1806 campaign, and therefore a witness to these events, refutes this idea. It has long been claimed that Berthier framed those instructions which were conceived with so much precision and usually transmitted with so much clearness, but I have had frequent opportunities of knowing that such was not the truth. The Emperor was his own chief staff officer. Although we could consider Jomini to be a somewhat biased source when commenting upon Berthier, mainly because a disagreement between them caused Jomini to defect to the Russians, if we continue our analysis of Napoleon's activity during the early hours of the 12th of October, then we will see that his work didn't stop with simply dictating this initial general order. Instead, we find him dictating 3 private letters, one each to Marshals Lannes, Murat and Soult. As a side note, I imagine that because Berthier and his cabinet, particularly Father Salamon's department, would now be writing out the official orders for each commander based upon that initial general order, then these private letters would in all likelihood have been dealt with by Napoleon's personal cabinet, and thus not require Berthier's supervision or signature. They would be sent out most likely by one of the attached junior aides-de-camp from the military household. We will show the letters to Soult and Lannes a little later, but first here is what Napoleon wrote to his brother-in-law. I shall be at Gera today before noon. You will see from the position of the army that I am completely surrounding the enemy, but I need information as to what it intends doing. I hope that you will find out at Zeitz. You saw what I did at Gera, do the same. Attack boldly everything which is on the march. These forces on the move are columns which endeavour to reach a meeting place, and the rapidity of movements prevents them receiving counter-orders in time. 2 or 3 successes of this kind will crush the Prussian army, and perhaps make a general encounter unnecessary. Marshal Davout sends all his cavalry direct to Naumburg. Cover the whole plain of Leipzig with yours. As you can see, although this letter contains no marching information, it does include instructions on reconnaissance and a clearer indication of what Napoleon requires Murat to do. The line, "You will see from the position of the army that I am completely surrounding the enemy," also suggests that Napoleon knew that Murat's orders would contain information on the positions of the other corps. Perhaps this was standard practice, and something that Napoleon knew Berthier would automatically include by using the information in the general order. However, there is one small point which indicates that Napoleon most likely gave additional verbal instructions whilst overseeing the writing of these individual orders. Those of you paying extremely close attention, and well done if you are, or perhaps those who are just familiar with the Jena campaign, may have noticed that Napoleon's initial general order failed to make any mention of Marshal Soult's 4th Corps, yet Berthier's orders to both Davout and Murat included the line, "Marshal Soult to Gera." Napoleon didn't in fact forget about him, and wrote to him as follows: "Muster at Gera and Roenburg. It is possible that you will not make any other movement today. I shall, moreover, be at noon at Gera, where headquarters are." Therefore, it seems likely that Berthier was either aware of the contents of this letter, or, more likely, simply told by Napoleon that Soult would move to Gera, so that he could then include that information in the individual orders. It should also be noted that, whilst this letter to Soult may be brief, there is perhaps a reason for it. Since the beginning of the entire Jena campaign, Napoleon had actually kept Marshal Soult, who was leading the right flank of the army, well informed as to his intentions regarding the strategical situation, and with the Marshal directed to Gera, where the Emperor and Imperial headquarters were to also be, then it is probable that Napoleon intended to give further instruction and insight directly in person. This would also explain why Napoleon felt no need to include Soult in that original general order. As a final proof of Napoleon's continued involvement in ironing out the details of his orders, we can turn to the instructions deigned for Marshal Lannes. If you recall, in the original general order, Lannes, like Murat, receives but a brief mention. Marshal Lannes proceeds toward Jena from Neustadt. However, here is the letter sent to the Marshal from Napoleon. "I have received with great pleasure the news of your affair on the 10th. I was yesterday evening at Gera. We have routed the enemy's baggage escort and taken 500 carriages. The cavalry is loaded with gold. You will receive the order concerning movements from the Chief of the Staff. All the letters intercepted prove that the enemy has lost its head. They hold councils day and night and do not know what measure to take. As you see, my army is united, and I bar their way to Dresden and Berlin. Our art at present consists in attacking everything we encounter in order to beat the enemy in detail, and whilst it is uniting its forces. When I say we must attack everything we encounter, I mean we must attack everything that is on the move, and not in a position which makes it too strong. The Prussians had already dispatched a column to Frankfurt, but they soon retreated. Up to the present they indeed show their ignorance of the art of war. Do not fail to send skirmishers ahead of you in order to intercept travellers and collect as much information as possible. Should the enemy make a movement from Erfurt to Saalfeld, which would be absurd, but, considering its position, we must expect all sorts of events, you will join Marshal Augereau and fall on the Prussians in flank." We can see that Napoleon has now considered what Lannes is to do in much more detail, here telling him to send out skirmishers and to intercept the enemy much in the same fashion as Davout and Murat. He also offers advice on what to do should the enemy make an unexpected move, in this case if they decide to push south to threaten La Grande Armée's line of communication. However, you will notice that once again any mention of movement is completely absent, and therefore to obtain his complete instructions, Lannes would require both this letter from the Emperor as well as his official orders via Berthier, which we can now look at. Marshal Lannes is ordered to proceed today with the whole of his army corps to Jena. I am ordering Marshal Augereau to proceed towards Calle. Marshal Ney will this evening be at Mittel, and Marshal Soult at Gera. Marshal Davout will be on the road from Mittel to Naumburg, and Marshal Bernadotte on the road from Gera to Naumburg via Seitz. Headquarters will be at Gera at noon. The Emperor's wish, Marshal, is that immediately on your arrival at Jena, you obtain all possible information as to the enemy's doings during the past 3 days. Open the letters at the post, question the postilions and keepers of posting houses in order to learn what the enemy is doing, and send messengers to Weimar. I beg to inform you that we captured yesterday on our right between Gera and Seitz more than 300 baggage vehicles, some artillery, precious objects and 200 prisoners. With this, Lannes now has his direction of march, but you may have noticed that he is also given additional instructions not even mentioned in Napoleon's private letter. Specifically, upon arriving at Jena, he is to open letters, question postmasters, and send scouts towards Weimar in order to determine the intentions of the enemy. Given that this order was completed half an hour after the private letter, it again seems clear that Napoleon, perhaps after a little more reflection, had this detail added to the order via verbal instruction. I find this last point interesting because by going through these orders as we have, I think that it offers us a small glimpse into the mind of Napoleon, and we can see him developing his plans. We can picture him studying his maps, assessing the information before him, trying to decipher what the Prussians are up to, and also figuring out what it is that he should do. Then, once he has mulled over multiple scenarios, he comes to a decision. He then dictates that first general order, which given its overall lack of detail, can almost be seen as a first draft, a quick way of getting his idea down on paper and out of his mind. With that done, he then begins to turn his attention upon the details, as seen through the private letters and instructions for the marshals, as well as offering additional input during the writing of the official orders. Essentially, after playing the role of Commander-in-Chief and figuring out the overall plan, he then switches to more of a Chief of Staff and works out the logistical details required to enact it. Of course, this switching is purely figurative in my description here, as I'm sure that in Napoleon's mind it was completely fluid, and he appears to quite naturally understand and account for many logistical matters throughout the creation of his ideas. Some of you may be questioning a part of this, given that earlier, when describing the General Staff, and specifically the 2nd Division under the command of General Dumas, we saw that Berthier wrote to the general asking him to find routes and roads for several of the corps marching into Bavaria. This therefore shows that Napoleon wasn't working out all the logistical details on his own, but of course he wasn't, and for several reasons. The first is that in this specific instance, frequently the choice of roads and routes was left to the discretion of the corps commanders, primarily because maps during this period were far from perfect and rarely 100% accurate, and it was therefore often best for the troops on the ground to select the roads upon which they travelled. We saw how this worked in this section of the letter from Berthier to Dumas. I have ordered that each General-in-Chief commanding an army corps shall appoint in his army an adjutant major charged exclusively with the same duties as those entrusted to you on the General Staff. These officers will correspond direct with you, receive your instructions and be responsible to you. These adjutant majors would therefore be tasked with working out the routes for their corps, and by reporting to Dumas, he could then ensure that no clashes between different corps would take place, whilst also offering any corrections or improvements. All of this was then reported to Napoleon via Berthier. The other reason why Napoleon wasn't doing all of the logistical work was that he simply didn't have the time to be everywhere and do everything. Even von Moltke had a team working under him to take care of the logistical details. He wasn't doing everything as the Chief of Staff, nor did he try to. Therefore, Dumas's role in working out the routes doesn't disprove that Napoleon was his own Chief of Staff. Jomini was correct in describing him in this way. It was simply that Napoleon didn't have the time to handle every single detail himself, although this didn't prevent him from believing that he could. In his excellent analysis, Vichet suggests that the Emperor himself said that the General Staff was the least necessary part of Grand Headquarters. The administrative part of headquarters was necessary for the upkeep of the army, but it seems as though the Emperor could alone, if need be, have set it in motion, put it into cantonments, and sent it forth to battle. It must also be remembered that Imperial headquarters was not only the centre of the army, but also of the Empire whenever Napoleon was on campaign, and therefore it was not just military matters over which Napoleon presided. Another witness to this situation was Claude the Meneval. one of Napoleon's secretaries during this period, and he suggests that Napoleon's desire to centralize and make as many decisions as possible stretched into the civil realm as well. Berthier, Talleyrand, and many others did not give an order or write a dispatch which had not been dictated by Napoleon. He took not only the initiative in thought, but also attended personally to the details of every piece of business. I do not contend that he was quite justified in thus wishing to do everything himself, but his genius, superhuman in its activity, carried him away. He felt he possessed the means and the time to manage everything. In reality, it was he who did everything. Whether you like or dislike Napoleon, one cannot help but admire the sheer mental capacity required to handle such a workload. However, as Meneval alludes to in the second half of that quote, this method of extreme centralization had several major drawbacks. One of the biggest and most obvious problems was that, even given Napoleon's abilities and self-delusion, he simply could not control nor do everything himself, particularly as the armies grew in size and the number of fronts expanded. What had been possible with moderately sized armies of 200,000 men in the halcyon days of 1805 or 1806 proved completely out of the question as his armies grew by rapid strides and a second front was added to further complicate the issue, and a Russian front at that. How could one man hope to control 600,000 troops spread over a distance of more than 500 miles in the days before radio? Yet that was exactly what Napoleon attempted to do, with well-known results. Although Chandler is absolutely correct that the issue of control perhaps reached its peak during the 1812 campaign, even in the halcyon days prior to this, there were still problems with the system. For, despite Napoleon's undoubted skill, he was still both human and attempting to undertake a monumental task, and therefore errors naturally crept in. One of the finest examples of this occurred prior to the Battle of Wagram in 1809. After the initial attempt to cross the Danube had been repulsed at the Battle of Aspern-Essling 6 weeks earlier, Napoleon's army had maintained control of the island of Lobau in the middle of the Danube, and he now sought to force another crossing to the northern bank, potentially again in the presence of the enemy. He consequently planned a complex operation, involving a diversionary attack whilst the main force crossed upon 3 bridges thrown across the river by the engineers. As commendable a plan as it was, the actual order contained a potentially critical error which was missed by both Napoleon and the staff. Jomini, ever eager to criticize Berthier, picks up the tale. The chief of the staff, although he made 10 copies of the famous decree, did not observe that by mistake the bridge of the centre had been assigned to Davout, who had the right wing, whilst the bridge on the right was assigned to Oudinot, who was in the centre. These 2 corps passed each other in the night, and had it not been for the good sense of the men and their officers, a dreadful scene of confusion might have been the result. The error doubtless originated with Napoleon whilst dictating his decree, but should it not have been detected by a chief of staff who made 10 copies of the order and whose duty it was to supervise the formation of the troops? It is easy to blame the staff for not correcting such an error, and Napoleon made complaints of similar incompetence during the 1812 campaign, commenting, "The staff is organised in such a manner that nothing is foreseen." Whilst he is absolutely correct here, the staff of Imperial Headquarters did tend to lack initiative. The issue is that this was a problem almost entirely of Napoleon's own creation. Statements such as, "Keep strictly to the orders which I give you, I alone know what I must do," as well as his insistence of doing as much of the intellectual work that he could, left little if any room for his staff to show any initiative. Nor was Imperial Headquarters ever an environment of education. It was a tool for Napoleon, and only Napoleon. The staff, unlike the modern Prussian staff, was not an educational institution. Had Moltke been wounded or fallen sick, there were other highly trained officers who could have filled his place with credit. Had Napoleon's sentry who fired on him on the eve of Jena aimed better, the subsequent history of the campaign would have been very different from what it was. This over-reliance upon one man hurt and stunted the development of the French staff system, not just during this period, but after it as well. The omnipotent military genius of Napoleon was not favourable to the development of a new capital staff. Indeed, his influence lay, like a dead hand, on the French attitude to the general staff for half a century after his death. In fact, because other nations, namely Prussia, did not possess a Napoleon of their own, they were forced to construct what we now understand to be the modern staff system, to create a setup which could theoretically emulate a genius via the combined thinking of several men. The lack of training for his subordinates is frequently laid at the feet of Napoleon, and whilst it does hold some merit, particularly in the realms of staff work, I think it is unfair to say that he never sought to improve the military education of his generals and marshals. His correspondence with his subordinates is littered with advice and encouragement, both towards the current campaigns as well as to the art of war as he understood it. Several of the marshals showed improvements under his leadership, particularly Lannes, whilst Jomini certainly acknowledged the military education that he received by observing and reflecting upon the emperor's methods. On several occasions, Napoleon even shared and explained his strategical plans and operations with specific marshals during campaign. To give a few examples, his correspondence with Soult during the opening stages of the Jena campaign, though too long to go through here, largely revealed his plans of operation and explained the formation of his army in the supposed Bataillon Carré, as well as the reasons for doing so. He made similar remarks to Ney during the Waterloo campaign. His message sent to the Marshal on the 16th of June, as well as explaining the events and operations for that day, also included the following passage. I have adopted for this campaign the following general principle, to divide my army into 2 wings and a reserve. Your wing will be composed of 4 divisions of the 1st Corps, 4 divisions of the 2nd Corps, 2 divisions of light cavalry, and 2 divisions of Count Valmy's corps. This ought not to fall short of 45 to 50,000 men. Marshal Grouchy will have almost the same force and will command the right wing. The Guard will form the reserve, and I shall draw troops from one wing to strengthen my reserve. Anyone familiar with the Waterloo campaign will know that Napoleon does indeed conduct it in this fashion, first using Ney to hold up Wellington at Quatre Bras, whilst he reinforces Grouchy and defeats the Prussians at Ligny. Then, Napoleon takes the reserve to join Ney, whilst Grouchy pursues the Prussians with his wing. This strategy was laid out in clear terms for Ney to understand prior to events. This tendency to open up to his marshals about his plans actually cost him dearly in early 1807, when the message sent to Bernadotte was intercepted by the Russians. Its contents revealed too much of his operation and enabled Bennigsen to react just in time to countermarch and escape the closing trap. Therefore, suggesting that Napoleon completely neglected his generals' military education is not completely true, and the fact that many of them failed to observe and learn his methods whilst being under his command is as much their fault as it is Napoleon's. I have nobody I can put in my place, neither here nor in the army. Without a doubt I would be very happy if I could make war through my generals, but I have accustomed them too much to knowing only how to obey. Amongst them all there is not one who can command the others, for all they know is to obey me alone. Whilst in many ways Napoleon is referring to the rivalries between the marshals that he in no small part frequently encouraged, the problem was that, no matter how competent his generals became, he had, perhaps unwittingly, created a system which would never allow any of them to become a true commander-in-chief. The emperor had forged for himself an instrument which he alone could wield. As long as it was animated by him, it served its purpose thoroughly, but there was no understudy capable of filling, even for a short space, the role of the leading actor. What Petre observes here is, in my opinion, the main problem with the French system, and in particular Imperial headquarters. It had been specifically designed by Napoleon, for Napoleon, and taking charge of its operation required more than the competence or even extreme talent that several of the marshals undoubtedly possessed. It required genius. This is why, despite all of the above problems, more often than not, when Napoleon was in command, the French were usually successful, particularly during this period of the Grande Armée. Although Napoleon's propensity of doing everything himself could and did cause problems, when he was on form and successfully able to combine the roles of Commander-in-Chief and Chief of Staff, thus effectively taking on the intellectual burden of at least 2 minds, he granted the army a mighty gift, that of time, something which we know to be a key component of warfare. Space we can recover, time never. Nevertheless, from a military point of view, this concentration in command enabled Napoleon to reduce to a minimum the blank time between the arrival at a decision and the setting in movement of the troops. This economy of time, of great importance in all branches of human industry, is an essential condition of success in war. It also cannot be overstated how advantageous it was for Napoleon to be not only head of the army, but also head of state, for it meant that he was clearly the sole voice of command. He was never required to validate his decisions to any equal, for his rule was absolute, and no one dared to question his by now proven military capabilities. Instead, his subordinates simply carried out his orders as swiftly as possible. Whilst Napoleon laid down a distinct and decided course from which no deviation was permitted, and no subordinate was allowed to press his own views, his enemies were perpetually hesitating, holding councils of war, and modifying their plans as one inferior commander or another, for the moment, obtained the ear of the council. This brings to mind Napoleon's famous statement, "Better one bad general than two good ones," as well as something Marshal Ney recognized and put in his own writings during the training camps at Boulogne. Irresolution in war is the most dangerous defect in a commander. It is often better to come to a bad decision immediately than to hesitate between several good ones, for the bad one always has some favorable side by which success may be obtained. Napoleon too was keenly aware of this, and at least during our period, irresolution was something that he was hardly ever guilty of, and with no one questioning him, indecision was rarely an issue for the French. As a contrast, notice how, at the same moment amongst his adversaries, controversy in councils of war was killing originality of thought, retarding a decision, leading to intermediate and slow solutions which let the opportunities for success slip by. In my own reading of multiple Napoleonic campaigns, it is very apparent and honestly quite startling just how much indecision was present at the different headquarters of the French opponents. Added to this was frankly an overcomplication of orders, often written to appease multiple voices, and which predictably never worked out as planned. In stark contrast, the French had no such issues under Napoleon's command. His orders were decisive and were honestly surprisingly simple in their appearance. This simplicity was enabled by the flexibility of, as well as the trust that he could place in, both the corps and their commanders. As I have mentioned in previous videos in this series, the French actually put a lot of faith and responsibility upon subordinate commanders, who were encouraged, within reason, to take the initiative. The orders were usually in line with the adage that they told the receiver what to do, but not how to do it. The means was left to the subordinate on the ground, who theoretically had the clearer understanding of the situation. Napoleon could direct what he considered the vital portion of the battle, but elsewhere his marshals were on their own. They had been told what to do and when to do it, but how to do it was almost always up to them. The marshals, in turn, frequently had to put a like reliance on their division commanders. In such conditions, a commander needed trustworthy officers to act as extensions of his eyes, ears and will, and sometimes in unexpected crises in a far corner of the battlefield, to think for him and to give orders in his name. Whilst Napoleon's orders, as we saw in the examples above, did include details, they were never drenched in them, and this faith in his subordinates also added to the speed at which orders could be written and enacted. When, at the dead of night, a good idea flashes through my brain, the order is given in a quarter of an hour, and in half an hour it is being carried out by the outposts. The timings here may be of slight exaggeration, but it is not that far from the truth, and this speed of logistics was something that the Allies simply couldn't compete with in their own systems. It is here, in my opinion, where the French were able to find the key to the speed of their operations. Their logistical system, when powered by Napoleon, meant that decisions were made and enacted much quicker than any of their opponents, and with these decisions being made by one of the greatest military minds in all of history, more often than not, these decisions will not only come too quickly, but they were usually right. However, to give Napoleon all the credit for the French logistical system would be a disservice to several other key components. If then, with Jomini, we consider the Chief of the Staff as being, and rightly so, the confidential assistant of the General-in-Chief, his intellectual collaborator who seconds him, is even in a position to direct everything himself, and who prevents errors by supplying him with sound information, we must recognize that Berthier did not fill with Napoleon such a role, for which, moreover, he had no aptitude. But this was not what Napoleon required of him. As chief of the staff, Berthier's duties were to copy the emperor's instructions, give movement orders and those concerning the administration, superintend the muster rolls, the organization, the staff, and finally carry out the active duties of war near the emperor. In recognizing Napoleon's significance to the French system, and in accepting that he did indeed function as his own chief of staff, and whose orders were not vague notions that required translating into functional orders, this should not downplay the role that Berthier played, nor the importance that he held to both Napoleon, and in particular to the functioning of imperial headquarters. In this more restricted, though still very important role, Napoleon appreciated Berthier's punctual exactitude, his passive obedience, exempt from the slightest comment, his discretion, modesty, vigilance, and scrupulous foresight in the copying and transmission of orders, all qualities which, on more than one occasion, assured the success of operations. The first thing to mention here, and in keeping with the previous section on Napoleon, is the passive obedience that Vichet highlights as a quality of Berthier's. This may seem a strange strength, but remember, Napoleon didn't need someone second-guessing or questioning his decisions, he simply needed them carrying out. Whilst this could lead to mistakes, as we saw at Wagram, it also helped to speed up operations. Speed and accuracy are the most important factors in staff work. To add to this obedience was a supreme professionalism, for Berthier took his work extremely seriously, at times to the point of overworking exhaustion, and in consulting Elting we find a paraphrasing of how Berthier viewed his role as Chief of Staff. The Chief of Staff is the headquarters pivot. He must see everything that comes in and sign, or at least approve, everything that goes out. The Assistant Chiefs of Staff must keep abreast of the general situation in addition to running their own sections. Speed and accuracy are the most important factors in staff work. The staff exists only for the good of the army and so has no regular office hours. It works as long as may be necessary, rests when it has nothing left to do, takes care of the troops before consulting its own comfort, and is always ready to move out regardless of the hour or pain involved. Up-to-the-minute intelligence on enemy forces and actions must always be available, therefore reconnaissance must be continuous to the front and flanks, and its results reported promptly. Finally, the Commander-in-Chief must always be told the truth, the whole truth, and nothing else, no matter how unpleasant the results may be. A few things in this overview are worth pointing out. The part on speed and accuracy we have already mentioned, but the lines following it shine a light upon Berthier's selfless devotion to his job and highlight his immense work ethic. In many places, Napoleon is famed for his ability to work both long hours and yet maintain an incredible focus, but in my reading on this topic, it was difficult not to come to the same conclusions for Berthier. Honestly, I still don't know when the man found time to sleep when on campaign. He seemed to always be either working or ready to work. There are a few quotes on him supposedly able to operate for several days in a row without sleep, and without the quality of his work ever slipping. There was even a joke that I read at one point that went, after a full day's riding alongside Napoleon, partaking in reviews and reconnaissance as well as issuing orders, Berthier would return to headquarters and relax by going through the daily reports. The man was honestly a machine, or maybe a vampire, as he does look suspiciously useful in most of his portraits, despite being 16 years older than Napoleon. His dedication also rubbed off on the staff around him, and whilst his cabinet was filled with devoted and professional workers, the general staff certainly respected his authority, for he led by example and was not afraid to chastise those who let the expected high standards start to slip. This sterner nature of Berthier's character also extended beyond the general staff and can be seen in his correspondence with both the marshals and his subordinates at corps level. He knew the importance of professionalism and demanded it from all in the name of the emperor. In writing to Ney in 1807, who had disobeyed his orders, his letter has a slight condescending tone of chastisement. The emperor, Monsieur le Maréchal, needs neither advice nor plans of campaign. No one knows his thoughts, and our duty is to obey. He was also much more than a glorified clerk, an extremely unfair assessment sometimes thrown his way, for although Napoleon very much was his own chief of staff, as we established he couldn't do everything, and so certain details were at times left for Berthier to sort out, a job he usually did without hesitancy and without seeking praise. For example, in 1805 Napoleon directed Berthier to organise a cuirassier division, giving only the time, place and regiments involved. Berthier wrote the necessary orders to the generals who would serve with it, the regimental commanders, the depots that would provide remounts, the artillery headquarters that would furnish the divisional artillery, and the administrative headquarters that would have to see that food, forage and quarters were available. Yet, for all his devotion and passive obedience, he was also one of the few marshals who could stand up to Napoleon when necessary. This line was something that Berthier stood by, and he would often find the courage to be the bearer of bad news to Napoleon, even when it earned him scorn, and once or twice even a physical beating from the emperor. Despite this, it was undeniable how much Napoleon liked and valued his chief of staff. Everybody knows how much the emperor was attached to Marshal Berthier. I had proofs of this during our sojourn at the Château de Marat. As the marshal was then suffering from gout, of which he had frequent attacks, the emperor went very often to see him in his little house he inhabited a quarter of a league from the chateau. As Thibaut, in an unwontedly fair-minded mood, remarked, Berthier was the man Napoleon needed, capable of relieving him of all detailed work, to understand him instantly and to foresee what he would need. Berthier was indeed the perfect staff officer for a commander who knew how to make up his mind without being prompted. Essentially, my own analogy in describing the roles and importance of both Napoleon and Berthier would be to describe Napoleon as the engine that drove imperial headquarters, whilst Berthier was the glue that held it together. Without Napoleon, it simply ceased to function, for it was both his genius and force of will that powered it into motion. But without Berthier, then things were liable to fall apart, and we see this during the Waterloo campaign, where Soult functions as an adequate chief of staff, but the staff work is not up to the usual high and professional standards previously expected. If Berthier had been here, I would not have met this misfortune. Finally, to round out this little epitaph to an often misaligned man, I think a slight underrated element that Berthier brought to Napoleon was, at least until the latter years, an almost unwavering belief and devotion in both person and duty, a quality which Talleyrand of all people seemed to have identified. With his perpetual need of analysing everything, even his own feelings, Napoleon came to ask himself why he, who hardly ever wasted his time over useless feelings, amused himself by loving so mediocre a man as Berthier. "It is because he believes in you," replied Talleyrand. To have inspired this fondness was one of Berthier's qualities. He was Napoleon's man, he was the chief of the staff who adapted himself to the genius and personality of the leader whom he served. Before we look at an example of imperial headquarters in action, it is prudent to first briefly explain how the staff and command structure of La Grande Armée worked from the corps level downwards, as well as to highlight its importance to aiding logistical matters. Subordinate headquarters were minor versions of the Grand Quartier Général, becoming simpler as they fell lower on the military totem pole. As discussed in the previous parts in this series, the corps system provided the French with an incredible advantage, particularly in its command structures, and logistically it was no different, for while imperial headquarters may appear somewhat chaotic in its organisation, from corps level downwards things were much more streamlined and relatively straightforward. In command of a corps was usually during our period a marshal, and he would have a general as his chief of staff, as well as 4 adjutant commandants, one of whom would act as deputy chief of staff. Then, depending upon the size of the corps, as strengths could and would vary, there would be a varying number of aides-de-camp and attached officers, frequently including Polish officers for the reasons stated previously. Also attached would be the general in charge of the corps artillery, along with his staff, as well as any commanders of attached units, such as engineers or pontoon troops. As an example from 1806, Davout, commanding the 3rd Corps, had 6 aides. The senior was Colonel Jean Burke, a general of brigade as chief of staff, 4 adjutant commandants, one of whom functioned as sous-chef, with another in charge of all reconnaissances, 5 captain adjoints, and 2 Polish captains. The chief of staff, sous-chef, and senior aide could speak in Davout's name. This staff also included the general and his staff, commanding the corps artillery, and a colonel of engineers. Elting also notes that when a marshal was in charge of a corps, he additionally would have a personal secretary or 2 attached to his headquarters to handle his correspondence. Below this corps command came the division, and in charge here would be a general of the division who would have an adjutant commandant to act as his chief of staff, as well as 3 aides-de-camp and attached officers. Like at corps level, there would also be attached to this divisional headquarters the divisional artillery commander and his staff. Divisions were then divided into brigades, but these were tactical organizations as opposed to administrative, and therefore its commander, a general de brigade, required no chief of staff and was allocated a single aide-de-camp. However, he would keep at his small headquarters attached officers from each of his combat units, who would maintain contact between battalion and brigade headquarters. As mentioned earlier, this revolutionary practice of attaching officers to the headquarters from each of the combat divisions was sensibly continued by the Grande Armée, and it extended up the command tree. Also, in a very modern style, each division was to have a liaison officer at its corps headquarters, and adjacent divisions were to exchange liaison officers. Once again, the idea with this entire corps command system was that orders would move down the command tree, whilst reports moved upwards. For example, once a marshal received his orders, his staff would assess and break them down. Each divisional commander would then receive the parts of this order in a form that was relevant to him, and he then did the same to his brigade commanders, who would then in turn instruct the battalion commanders. In reverse of this, at the end of each day, regardless of any action taking place, each battalion commander would submit a report to his brigade commander stating the strength and location of his battalion. These reports were then compiled and sent up to divisional headquarters, where they were again compiled and then sent to corps headquarters. The staff here would then write up a full report based upon all of this, which would then be sent on to Berthier at Imperial headquarters in the hands of an ADC. This aide would remain at Imperial headquarters until fresh orders had been written, at which point he would return with these to his corps, and the entire cycle would repeat. 2 hours before dusk each evening, each corps sent a staff officer to army headquarters with its latest reports. The officer would be fed and assigned a place to sleep, if only under a leaky tree, until Napoleon's orders were ready for him to carry back early in the morning. Of course, although this structure and operation appears streamlined on paper, its effectiveness in the field would very much depend upon the quality of the marshal and his staff at all levels of command. Unsurprisingly, some staff were far more efficient than others, both in writing and issuing orders for their subordinates, as well as collecting and sending back reports to Imperial headquarters. Elting notes that during the campaigns in Poland in 1806-07, Davout was constantly hounding his cavalry commander to improve the accuracy of naming towns in his reports, whilst it was inaccurate and late reporting that caused the rift between Berthier and Jomini in 1813. Jomini, acting as chief of staff to Marshal Ney, was arrested because Berthier had deemed his reports too slow, inadequate, and therefore grounds for court-martial. The self-inflated ego of Jomini would of course not stand for such accusations, and he therefore defected to the Russians. Now that we hopefully have an understanding of the French logistical system in place, I thought that we could run through its operations step by step, and see how Napoleon was able to utilize it in order to conduct some of the fantastic manoeuvres that La Grande Armée frequently accomplished. However, before Napoleon could make any decisions or issue any orders, he first had to gather all the necessary information, starting with his own army, and this was done in a variety of ways. When not on campaign, Napoleon would still demand constant updates regarding the state of his various armies, and he received this via 4 books, or livrets, updated and given to him twice a month via his Minister of War, and which contained all the information he could desire. The livret par ordre numérique furnished a complete statement of the situation in every regiment in his armies, the names of its officers, its strength, the localities where it was stationed, the location of its depot, the number of sick and wounded, the number of recent conscripts assigned to it, and the departments from which they came. A second leafway showed the status of every territorial military division in his empire, number and type of barracks, number of beds in each, the names of the general commanding the division and his staff and intendants officers, and a detailed report on all troops in that division, including veterans and gendarmes. Artillery stores, including firearms and ammunition, were the subject of the third livret. The fourth dealt with conscription, the number of men due from each department, the number reporting, and the units to which they were assigned. I'm not 100% sure if this was the method used during 1805-07, as Elting in this quote is commenting on the situation in 1811, but I imagine that something similar, if not quite as polished, was probably used. When on campaign, however, one of the main ways that Napoleon was kept updated was mentioned in the previous section, and that was via the reports sent into Imperial headquarters from each corps. The most basic of these was the état de situation, submitted every day by each unit to its next superior headquarters in the chain of command, showing the unit strength, routes followed, actions, casualties, replacements received, supplies available, enemy situation, and present location. These daily reports were supplemented by more thorough reports to be sent either weekly or every fortnight, and these would be expected to also include muster rolls of the men present. Berthier had actually devised standardized worksheets which enabled officers to fill in all of the above information in a consistent manner, and in his role within headquarters, he was constant in his hounding of the junior chiefs of staff at corps level to get them filled in and sent as regularly as possible. I order you always to send me, without delay, the position of your cantonments when any change has been made in them, His Majesty having expressly ordered me to hand him daily a detailed report relating to the position of the Grand Army. Once they arrived at Imperial headquarters, Berthier's cabinet would combine them into a format which Napoleon could easily access all relevant information regarding his forces. These are referred to by Chandler as the carnet. Those referring to military affairs were organized as follows. Each regiment would be allocated a page, subdivided into columns, on which were entered the names of the commanding officer, the major, the senior officers, a list of engagements, the position of the depot, a list of casualties, of those presently in hospital, of recruits under training, and the areas from which they were drawn. With this information in his hands, Napoleon would then spend several hours of each day going through it all, applying his notorious attention for detail in noting all changes and any discrepancies. Despite the statistical and arguably dry nature of these reports, it seemed that he took immense pleasure in this activity. I take more pleasure in this perusal than a young girl does in reading a novel. Those of us who enjoy poring over the orders of battle probably understand what he means, but as much fun as that can be, Napoleon was also well aware that paper strength did not always equal reality. To him, war was not a game of chess played merely in the privacy of his study. His activity outside was no less great than his intellectual activity. That is why, alongside these reports, Napoleon also insisted on regular reviews of the troops, preferably in person, but if not, then through one of his aides, who were given instructions to be as thorough as possible, both in their inspection and in their returning report. However, when able to inspect matters with his own eyes, then this was another area which showcased Napoleon's impressive eye for detail, as well as his compulsion to do as much of the work himself. During the 2 years the Grande Armée spent training around Bologna, Napoleon was a frequent visitor to the camps to oversee matters and ensure that things were going as he desired. Savary relates that, despite usually arriving very early in the morning, a moment later he was on horseback, and he often did not leave the saddle until night. Not until he had seen the lowest soldier and the most ordinary workshop did he return, so that before retiring to rest he knew more about the state of his affairs than if he had read volumes of reports. Napoleon understood that not only could the numbers on the page be manipulated, but they could never reveal the factors that truly mattered, such as morale, which these in-person visits not only measured but also helped to bolster. Consistently desiring to examine things for himself was a habit that Napoleon maintained even during campaign, where he would regularly be in the saddle and in constant observation of his troops, chatting to passing soldiers, questioning officers, and generally keeping his eye on all things. During one incident in 1805, when observing the light cavalry of his guard passing by, Napoleon, with his trained eye, estimated their strength, but in consulting his own notebook he noticed a discrepancy, and he immediately questioned their commander, General Moulin, about it. "Your regiment is down in my notes as having 1,200 men, and although you have not yet had an engagement with the enemy, you have no more than 800 horsemen there. What has become of the others?" Events such as this were commonplace, and whenever possible new detachments or units would have their routes of march set to ensure that they passed by Imperial headquarters before heading to the front, whereby Napoleon would conduct a thorough inspection. Other times, between engagements, corps or regular units would be required to do the same, and Napoleon used these opportunities as much more than just pomp and circumstance. They were his way of understanding the strengths and capabilities of the men he commanded. The Emperor's review was not a mere ceremonious display at which the commander-in-chief was content with galloping more or less brilliantly in front of the troops. It was a serious operation, a veritable act of control, immediately followed by rewards or punishments. Thus armed with a thorough understanding of his own army, Napoleon now required knowledge of his opponent, and he once again had several methods of doing so. There are 4 means of obtaining information of the enemy's operations. The first is a well-arranged system of espionage. The second consists in reconnaissances made by skillful officers and light troops. The third in questioning prisoners of war. The fourth in forming hypotheses of probabilities. As to be expected with Imperial headquarters at this point, these methods listed by Jomini were handled by multiple departments and with the usual amounts of crossover. The first, the system of espionage, operated at the highest level chiefly through Napoleon's personal cabinet, more specifically the Bureau de Renseignement, which was operated by General Savary. He would collect information from any of the major spies that were under employment. The most famous of these was a Charles Schulmeister, who successfully infiltrated General Mack's Austrian headquarters during the Ulm campaign in 1805. This department would also gather the information given to them from the various French diplomats and ambassadors, who were always expected to keep tabs on any information regarding the composition and movement of enemy troops, along with relaying any other useful bits of information that they witnessed during their various foreign deployments. Foreign newspapers were also frequently examined for similar reasons, and any useful information regarding the enemy was noted and transmitted to Napoleon. It seems that much of this work was done by Lelogne de Ideville, who bore the title Secretary-Interpreter for Northern Languages, though this hardly covers his job description, which involved compiling all of the available data upon the enemy forces and converting it into an easy-to-read format for Napoleon to digest. The muster rolls which Monsieur de Ideville succeeded in supplying were drawn up with so much sagacity and accuracy that the Emperor knew the composition of foreign armies quite as well as that of the French. On a much smaller scale, each corps commander was granted money in order to purchase the service of spies and informants, the information from which would be added to the daily corps reports, or, if it was critical information, sent back immediately to Imperial headquarters via an aide-de-camp. My research seems to suggest that, at least during the period of La Grande Armée, the French were much more willing than their opponents to spend money acquiring information in this manner, and many of the spies were in fact financially convinced to switch allegiance to the French. This form of espionage also involved the interception of letters or orders, examples of which we saw in our analysis of the orders given to Lannes, instructing him to go through all letters at the post office in Jena. Regarding the duty of reconnaissance, once again General Savary took the lead for Napoleon's cabinet, although several of the imperial aides would also do the same if Napoleon required. Savary, however, does seem to have been one of the better able and most trusted for these missions, and frequently ventured beyond the advance guard of the army, operating undercover in some instances to obtain any information on the enemy. Much of this information would usually be of a more long-term strategic nature, because for more immediate information it would be up to the corps, specifically their light cavalry, to acquire it. This was done via patrols and reconnaissance missions, both to make contact with the enemy, as well as to prevent enemy patrols from penetrating the French intentions. We saw in the examination of Napoleon's orders that he implored his marshals to send cavalry before them to gather information and intercept the enemy. Although the image and reputation of the French light cavalry, particularly the hussars, is highly regarded during the Empire, The sources that I've examined seem to give a mixed review as to their abilities in terms of reconnaissance and patrols. Some seem to suggest that they would too often utilize the same roads and routes, resulting in missed information or worse, walking into ambushes. Napoleon usually insisted on strong patrols being used to avoid the latter as much as possible. It seems, however, that like most things, their ability varied depending upon the officer in charge of the cavalry. Marshal Davout, for example, being an ex-cavalryman himself, scrupulously trained his light horsemen, enabling him to utilize them for much smaller but further reaching probes into enemy lines. Partial credit for Davout's understanding in this department, as well as to General Savary's, should go to General Desaix, whom both of these men served under during the Revolutionary Wars. Desaix, it seems, recognized early on the true importance of military intelligence, keeping himself as informed as possible on the situation of both the enemy as well as friendly forces. As Elting notes, if he did not consciously train Davout and Savary, they certainly learned from his example. Once contact was made with the enemy, then one of the best methods of acquiring more information was through the taking and interrogation of prisoners. Again, this was done via multiple departments, although chiefly it would be at corps level where most prisoners would be captured and therefore processed, any information then being passed on to Imperial headquarters. Napoleon, of course, still involved himself in the details at this level, delving into the specifics, instructing his subordinates in what to look out for, and in some cases even suggesting the methods on how to acquire the necessary information. He also ordered prisoners captured by Eugene at Raab, escorted by Polish lancers, picked for their intelligence, who were to chat casually with them and obtain all possible information concerning their regiments. Captured officers of a particularly high rank would usually be sent to Imperial headquarters for further questioning, by either Napoleon's cabinet, or if necessary, Napoleon and Berthier themselves would question a prisoner. Although in these various methods of obtaining information on the enemy, Imperial headquarters has its usual amount of overlap and crossed wires, it does seem that much of the information acquired was shared between all of the relevant departments, and not just centralized through Napoleon, even if he was its ultimate destination. Therefore, although inefficient, for a modern staff would have it all operating through one specific department, they at least communicated and kept each other in the loop. As well as these official ways of gathering information, Napoleon frequently bypassed the entire system, and made extensive use of both his aide-de-camp and orderly officers to get him specific information quicker regarding both the enemy and his own forces. For example, on the 13th of October 1806, the day before the Battle of Jena, and the day after he had issued the set of orders we examined earlier, Napoleon was still in the dark as to the exact location and intention of the Prussians. In an attempt to rectify this as soon as possible, he therefore dictated the following two orders. General Lemeroy must proceed to Naumburg at full speed. There he will see Marshal Davout's position. At Naumburg he will obtain information regarding the enemy. He will see if the river Unstrut has been crossed and where the enemy is. Afterwards, at full speed, he will bring me the information he has collected to Jena, where I shall be at noon. General Lemeroy, you may recall, was an imperial aide-de-camp, but Napoleon also made use of an orderly officer for a similar, though shorter, mission. Orderly officer Scherb must proceed at full speed to Jena. He will see what is happening. He will obtain information regarding the enemy and return with it to me. He will bring me news of Marshal Lannes and of the enemy's movements. No matter which method was used, all of this information was designed to assist Napoleon in what Jomini defines as the fourth method of figuring out the enemy, that of hypothesizing their intentions, and this was a job which only Napoleon was permitted to do. Send for the Albe. Barclay de Albe was the man tasked with setting up Napoleon's study when on campaign, a room which was always required, even at the expense of a bedroom, for if space was restricted, then Napoleon would be content with simply placing his camp bed in one of the corners. Within this study, de Albe would set up Napoleon's desk, arranging upon it the relevant orders of battle, situational reports, essentially all of the information gathered via the methods outlined in the previous two sections, along with any relevant maps as well as his travelling library. If no desk was available, then one was usually made using 2 trestles and several planks of wood. This was Napoleon's workstation, but the dominating feature of the room was possibly the most important. In the middle of the room was a large table on which the best map of the seat of war was spread out. By means of colours, the Alb had made clear on this map the position of rivers, mountains or frontiers. This map was very accurately orientated before Napoleon entered, and with pins with heads of various colours there was marked, first of all, the position of the different corps of the French army, and then the positions of the enemy as far as they were known. This master map was the quickest way that Napoleon could, at a glance, view the overall situation. For use with this map, de Albe also ensured that a compass was set up to the correct distance that corresponded to an average day's march in context to the scale of the map. This enabled Napoleon to quickly estimate timings, routes of march, and ensure that the spacing between his corps was as mutually supporting as possible. As mentioned earlier, de Albe was one of the first people that Napoleon summoned upon arriving at headquarters, and one of the last that he spoke to before leaving. The constant updating of the map, as well as the organisation of his study, was of the utmost importance to the Emperor, and de Albe had the unenviable task of ensuring that everything was in order, day or night. Frequently he would be forced to update the positions of the various armies, with Napoleon very much on the map itself, a humorous situation that led to many an accidental clash of heads. Barclay de Albe undoubtedly helped the Emperor in his planning to a very real degree. Together they would crawl over the surface of the map, pressing in more pins, and cursing or grunting when their heads or hindquarters came into collision. This study, varying in size depending upon its location, was essentially the real heart of both Imperial headquarters and the Grand Armée, for it was where Napoleon conceived of almost all of the details of his military operations, either sprawled across the large master map, working at his desk, or else pacing around the room. As vital as de Albe was to the setup and operation of this room, all decisions were ultimately in the domain of the Emperor, and he would ruminate for much time, switching between his desk and the map, rummaging through different papers, muttering to himself, all in order to get straight the situation before conceiving the best course of action as he saw it and based upon all his prior experience. Once Napoleon had decided, he would call for someone to take dictation, usually one of his secretaries, who would have been sat in an empty corner, working on other matters, but always ready to scribble down things at a moment's notice. When his idea had reached maturity, he began to walk slowly about the room and traverse its entire length. He then began to dictate in a serious and emphatic voice, without resting for a moment. As inspiration came to him, his voice assumed a more animated tone, and was accompanied by a sort of habit which consisted in a movement of the right arm, which he twisted, at the same time pulling the cuff of the sleeve of his coat with his hand. In rendering his thought, expression came without effort. They were sometimes incorrect, but their very incorrectness added to the energy of his language, and ever marvellously described what he wished to say. Claude Meneval frequently took dictation, but this was not a job exclusive to his role as secretary, for Napoleon would also dictate to Berthier, Daru, Caulaincourt, even his imperial aide-de-camp. It didn't particularly matter, nor was it important that they were military-minded or not. The key point was that they could write quickly, for Napoleon usually spoke fast, with the result being that in most cases only the person who took the dictation could understand and relate what was written. Orders concerning military matters would usually be addressed to Berthier as chief of the staff. When Berthier received a written order from the Emperor, he, after reading it himself, handed it to the secretary whose department it concerned. If it concerned more than one, each in turn, after noting the part concerning himself, passed it to his neighbour. When the detailed orders required had been prepared, they were handed to the Assistant Major General for issue through the department concerned. As previously discussed, if the order was regarding troops or matters outside of the main army, such as fortress troops or supplies, then Berthier would pass it on to the appropriate division of the General Staff, under the supervision of its Assistant Chief of Staff. However, for orders relating to the movement and organisation of the main army, then things would be handled through Berthier's cabinet, usually by the department headed by Father Salomon. With Berthier's guidance, Salomon, along with his aides, would divide up the work and write out as many copies of the orders as were necessary, including a master copy which would be kept in the headquarters archive. Although many of the sources suggest that this work of copying was done in strict silence and without interruption, a rule that even Napoleon kept to, as we witnessed in our earlier analysis, Napoleon clearly gave additional instructions during their writing, therefore it is difficult to fully go along with this. I would say that the general rule was probably to maintain silence so as to ensure the accuracy and speed of the writing, but if Napoleon felt the need to interrupt and add any additional details, then he would do. I mean, who was going to stop him? He was emperor after all. Our earlier analysis also showed that, in addition to these orders, Napoleon would also dictate letters to the various corps commanders, offering additional details and advice. As I previously mentioned, with Berthier and his cabinet busy with the main orders, I imagine that this was done by Napoleon's cabinet. Once Salomon and his team had finished, the orders were then checked over and signed off by Berthier, who then assigned the various ADCs to take them to the recipients. Usually this aide-de-camp would be the one who had brought the corps report the previous evening, and having spent the night at Imperial headquarters would return to his corps as soon as orders were ready. However, in the case of urgent or vital orders, Berthier would often assign multiple aides to each carry a copy of the message via alternate routes, thus increasing the chance of its safe arrival. This was particularly prudent during the campaigns in Poland in 1806-07, where a combination of inadequate maps, poor weather, worse roads, and swarms of roving Cossacks meant that communications were frequently interrupted. These orders would usually also require a signature from the recipient, acknowledging both his receipt and understanding of the order. If there was no corps-level aide-de-camp at Imperial headquarters, then the choice of ADC would be decided by the duty roster which Berthier established. This was rotated every 24 hours, but the first two aides listed were always expected to be on duty, and if extra personnel were needed, then Berthier would work his way down the list as required. Corps level would presumably conduct similar practices, while at the lower levels, which consisted of smaller and smaller staffs, things were a little different. Lower headquarters, having few aides-de-camp and small staffs, of necessity made use of enlisted men termed ordonnances, orderlies, or chevaliers d'ordonnance, to carry reports and orders. They were detailed from light cavalry regiments, 2 to each brigade, 4 to each division, to be rotated every 24 hours. These corps light cavalry units were also at times expected to detach elements in order to set up and man relay stations, usually consisting of about 8 men along with an NCO to ensure that they didn't wander off. By establishing these relays every 8 miles or so, the idea was to keep in better contact with headquarters and establish either a faster method of sending messages, for one of the troopers could relieve the previous messenger and then gallop his horse to the next station, where he himself would then be relieved, or simply the presence of these stations helped to ensure a safer and easier to follow route for the aides to travel. Understandably, cavalry colonels hated this practice as it weakened their regiment. One famous example I can recall of it taking place was actually during the Battle of Waterloo, where Colonel Marlborough, commanding the 7th Hussars, was tasked by Napoleon to set up relays heading to the east in order to link up and maintain communications with Marshal Grouchy, who, ideally, would have done the same with his cavalry. Of course, Grouchy never did, and Marlborough merely became the advance warning for the arrival of the Prussians instead. As can be imagined, being an aide-de-camp was a dangerous job, for riding alone meant that it was easy to get lost or captured, and Marlborough even mentions getting attacked by wolves at one point, but matters only got worse on the battlefield, where one might be expected to ride into the maelstrom of an ongoing combat in order to deliver a vital message. For this reason, and for the sake of fairness, at corps headquarters, the aides-de-camp would line up, with the first in line receiving the next order. When, and potentially if, he returned from his mission, he then took his place at the rear of the queue. Although Berthier was a stickler for having all orders, no matter how trivial, properly written out and recorded, during battle, where time was ever vital, Napoleon would sometimes simply issue verbal orders. To ensure their accuracy, the aide was expected to repeat the order back to Napoleon before he was allowed to ride off and deliver it. For this reason, the importance of Napoleon's imperial aide-de-camp can be seen, for these were men who had experience and understanding of their master's methods and means, and could therefore be trusted to handle such missions without requiring long explanations. Of course, given their status, these were also men who could be trusted not just to deliver the proposed message, but to also take command and carry it out themselves, should the situation require it. An example of this took place at the Battle of Borodino, where, after General Montbrun was killed, Napoleon called forth General Caulaincourt from his staff, the younger brother of the one previously mentioned in this video. Caulaincourt, being a fine cavalry general, was instructed to take over Montbrun's command and to lead the cavalry in attacking the Great Russian Redoubt. His men would be successful in this endeavour, but he was unfortunately struck and killed by a cannonball when leading the assault. I know that this video is already long, believe me, but before we finish, I just wanted to work through a fictional scenario to summarise all of the above. This is extremely basic, but hopefully it clears up much of what we have just discussed, and enables you to see just how efficiently and rapidly the Grande Armée could operate thanks to both the flexibility of the corps, as well as the logistical systems in place. The orders for today have Davout's 3rd Corps marching to point A, Lannes' 5th Corps marching to point C, whilst Imperial Headquarters is to be at point E. Each element spends the day marching and encounters no real difficulties. Upon arriving at point A, Davout's corps then halts, and whilst the troops settle down for food and rest, the officers begin writing their reports. In these reports, each chef de battalion records the status and strength of his battalion, their location of bivouac, the routes by which they travelled, etc. Once completed, it is then sent to the brigade commander, who combines these reports in order to create his own, adding any additional information that he deems important, before then sending it to his divisional commander, who does the exact same at his level, before sending this divisional report off to corps headquarters. Here, Davout and the Chief of Staff then compile and assess these reports, before once again adding any additional information where required. This final corps level report is then given to one of Davout's ADCs, who rides to Imperial Headquarters at point E. At the same time as this is happening, Lannes' corps will be undergoing the exact same process. You can see here how the speed of this operation very much depended upon the competency of the staff at all levels, including the marshal in charge, and in particular it was the corps chief of staff's job to hound the lower level commanders to hand in their completed reports as swiftly as possible. Fortunately, in our example here, both Davout and Lannes are competent commanders who keep a tight grip on their subordinates, and therefore these corps reports are sent off promptly, arriving at Imperial Headquarters at around 10 PM. Upon arrival, the ADCs are taken to Marshal Berthier, who, after taking receipt of the reports, asks any additional questions as may be necessary regarding the corps' situation. After this meeting, the ADCs are given food and a place to rest, and with the corps now in bivouac, Imperial Headquarters springs to life. These reports are gathered together and combed through for all details by Berthier and his cabinet, and whilst the Marshal puts together a report for Napoleon to read on all details that may concern him, the positional information is handed to d'Albe, who begins to update the master map in the Emperor's study. He moves the pins to account for the new positions of the corps troops, as well as any information acquired on enemy positions, whilst also updating the flags attached to these pins with any new information concerning unit strengths. Whilst all this is happening, Napoleon is actually fast asleep, having retired at around 8 PM after a brief supper with Berthier. He asked not to be disturbed unless the reports brought urgent information, which today's reports did not. However, at around 1 AM, Napoleon is finally woken, for Berthier has finished his report and d'Albe has also updated the map, meaning that the task is now in the hands of the Emperor. He immediately gets to work, losing himself in absorbing every piece of relevant information as he aims to figure out exactly what the enemy are doing, whilst also figuring out how best to counter it. He crawls upon his map table, using his compass to check march distances, as various ideas and schemes flash through his mind, the final decision slowly starting to formulate, until finally it is ready. "Write this down," he calls, breaking Meneval out of his light sleep. The poor man scrambles for fresh pen and paper before Napoleon starts to dictate a general order outlining the basis of his new ideas. His secretary reads it back, and meeting his master's approval, it is written out in full and handed to Marshal Berthier in the next room. After quickly reading it through, Berthier sets Father Salomon the task of breaking it down into the relevant parts and writing out the orders in full for both Lannes and Davout. In quick time this is completed, and these official orders are handed to Berthier, who after reading them through, signs his approval. With the orders now ready, the ADCs sent by Davout and Lannes are woken and told to return to their respective corps with these new marching instructions. This is perhaps 4 AM in the morning, and by the time they arrive at corps headquarters, it is 5 AM. Focusing again on 3rd Corps, these fresh orders are handed to Marshal Davout, and after reading them through, he adds a few minor details of his own, and instructs his staff to then write out instructions relevant for the different divisions, which upon completion are sent out. This process repeats at divisional and then brigade level, and by 6:30, not only are the battalion commanders informed of their daily marching destination, but the leading troops are already on the road. Davout's corps is to march to point B, land to point D, whilst Imperial Headquarters continues to point F. The army is once again in motion, but by mid-morning there is a problem. What starts as a small skirmish quickly escalates, and Marshal Lannes finds himself engaged with strong enemy forces. He quickly sends aides to hurry up the other divisions of his corps, whilst his chief aide-de-camp is ordered to Imperial Headquarters with an urgent message for Napoleon, informing him of the escalating situation. This aide spares neither time nor horse, and upon arriving at Imperial Headquarters, he is first presented to Berthier, who, understanding the situation, immediately takes him to Napoleon, with whom the aide quickly shares his news in as much detail as possible. Napoleon's action is swift and decisive, and after quickly consulting his map, he gives the ADC merely a verbal order for Lannes, instructing him to hold his ground and pin the enemy. The ADC is given a fresh horse and sets off back immediately to Lannes, whilst Napoleon dictates to Berthier new orders for Marshal Davout, who is to now halt his march upon point B, and instead march through point F and come quickly to the aid of 5th Corps. Whilst Berthier is expanding this short-form dictation into a readable order, Napoleon informs one of his Imperial aide-de-camp to ride to Lannes' position, find out all that he can about the situation, and then meet the Emperor on the road with his report. Without hesitation, this aide is immediately in the saddle, on his way towards the growing sound of gunfire. With no representative of 3rd Corps at Imperial Headquarters, as it is only midday and no reports have yet been sent, Berthier instead tasks one of his own aide-de-camp to take the message to the Marshal, urging haste and to return with Davout's written confirmation of both the receipt and his understanding of the order. Consulting his maps once more, Napoleon measures the distance between Lannes and Davout, estimating how long it will take the latter to reach the scene of the battle. He is also concerned as to what might lie beyond point F, and if it might potentially threaten the flank of Davout's new march route. He therefore calls in General Savary and orders him to ride beyond point F and to ensure that it is clear of the enemy. But if it is not, then he is to report to Marshal Davout first before returning with the news to him. Satisfied that he has done all that he can for the moment and that his presence will be better felt on the battlefield, Napoleon announces his intention to depart, and within moments his horse, already saddled, is brought to him, and accompanied by several aides as well as a small escort of chasseurs, he sets off towards Lannes. Meanwhile, thanks to some hard riding, Berthier's young and cocky aide-de-camp finds Marshal Davout at the head of his corps and hands him his new orders. Quickly grasping the severity of the situation, the Marshal orders his leading division to turn onto a side road and march as quickly as possible through point F and towards the apparently developing battle. He then instructs his aides to inform the other divisions of the new movement to the east, whilst he and a small escort ride ahead of his corps, ideally to find Napoleon on the battlefield and receive any additional instructions and adjustments before his corps can arrive. Thus, La Grande Armée is a blur of activity, yet a clear chain of command, as well as Napoleon's complete centralization of decision, allows decisive action and a semblance of order and clarity to reign through the chaos. This is of course a fictional account, and things would not be quite as smooth nor as simple when taking into account an entire army of multiple corps, along with issues of supply and more complicated topography. But despite all of that, I thought it was hopefully both interesting and informative to show how a potential scenario might have played out, and give my thoughts, based upon the research, as to what I believe the chain of events would have looked like, with the various messengers and orders going back and forth, as well as the speed at which the army could react to unforeseen events. Finally, within this example, there was also mentioned another small detail that further aided the speed of French operations, and that was the work hours of Imperial Headquarters and the sleeping pattern of Napoleon. Essentially, when on campaign, the army operated by day, Imperial Headquarters by night. Of course, as this example shows, Imperial headquarters continued to function throughout the day, but much of its work was done once the Corps had halted and the reports came in. It is why I was wondering when Berthier managed to sleep, as the staff were always working, but I suppose he might have been able to snatch a few hours whilst Napoleon was figuring out his plans. Maybe. I should also mention that working the night shift was admittedly not unique to the French, for the staff of other armies in many examples stayed up late to finish writing out orders, but at least from my research, it never seemed to be the standard practice in the way that it was for the French. Of course, one thing that other nations didn't have was Napoleon, and I found his sleep habits to be rather ingenious in a sense. Once the Corps had stopped, but before the reports had come in and been compiled by Berthier, there was not a lot that Napoleon could actually do, and he therefore would sleep. When the reports were ready, usually between midnight and 1 AM, he would then wake and get to work. Once he had decided on what to do and dictated the orders, he would then oversee their completion before returning to bed for a further hour or so. Only after that would he then begin his day properly, usually spent in the saddle riding to wherever he needed to be. This was again just another simple way of reducing any potential downtime, whilst also ensuring that he himself remained alert. A tired general is worse than a bad one. I have quoted that as from General Patton, but I couldn't find any confirmation that he actually said it. Regardless, the point is still valid, and by adapting to such a sleep schedule, Napoleon ensured that he would at least get some rest. He also famously slept during at least 2 battles to my recollection, at both Wagram and Bautzen, where he simply lay down on a blanket and took a fairly long nap, seemingly undisturbed by the artillery going on around him. In the finest imperial manoeuvres, one does not know which to admire the most, the initial idea or the manner in which it was carried out. The splendid combinations which threaten the existence of the armies of Wurmser, Milas, Mack and Brunswick were in themselves skillful manoeuvres and would alone have brought about the defeat of the enemy, but they would only have jeopardized the fate of these armies. They would not have destroyed them without that brilliant execution, vigor and rapidity which have astonished the world. This rapidity in French operations is often credited to factors such as the corps system, rates of march, or the idea that the French solely lived off of the land. Although these factors were certainly relevant, it is in my opinion that one of the biggest factors of French success was the logistical advantage that they held over their adversaries. Although most major European nations in the second half of the 18th century had begun to formulate a general staff, designed to cope with the increasing logistical problems that came about as a natural consequence of dividing armies into smaller, more maneuverable parts, it was the French that took the lead. Their initial attempt at professionalization of this general staff may have been rebuked by the Revolution, but as the wars progressed, the importance of such a system was soon realized, and prominent staff officers such as General Berthier were able to show the indisputable value that lay in fast and accurate staff work. Through the creation of the Grande Armée in 1805, the French also began to perfect the idea of dividing up their armies through the corps system, and the autonomy and clear command structures that this provided, alongside the professionalism at all staff levels instilled by Berthier, offered the French an almost unparalleled flexibility within their operations. However, as important as these factors certainly were, they were not the chief cause of either the French army's masterful strategic movements, nor of the impressive operational speed at which they were carried out. These instead bore the mark of a master. Of course, this beautiful simplicity of strategic movement with its infinite flexibility is extremely deceptive. The task of correlating and coordinating the daily movements of a dozen or more major formations, all moving along separate routes, of ensuring that every component is within 1 or at most 2 days marching distance of its immediate neighbours, and yet at the same time preserving the appearance of an arbitrary and ill-coordinated scatter of large units in order to deceive the foe concerning the true gravity of the situation. This is the work of a mathematical mind of no common calibre. The mind to which Channa is referring belonged of course to Napoleon, and it was in here that we find the main driving force of the French logistical system. Once he became the head of both state and the army, Napoleon was able to centralize almost all major decision-making through himself, and the absolute nature of his rule meant that his decisions were never questioned, they were instead instantly obeyed by willing subordinates. For the French army, this centralization crucially meant that the decision-making process was as smooth as possible, with no delays for the debates and councils of war that plagued the staff of other armies. Instead, it was simply swift, decisive action. However, Napoleon also offered much more than that, for his undoubted genius enabled him to operate not just as commander-in-chief, but also as chief of staff, a dual role which combined strategical and logistical thinking. This once again reduced the time between decision and action, because Napoleon didn't have to conceive of a strategy and then wait for a member of the staff to figure out how to logistically make it possible. In Napoleon's mind, the logistical factors and the strategic planning went hand in hand. Of course, centralizing an entire system had its drawbacks, because to make it happen, the entirety of imperial headquarters had to be shaped to fit Napoleon's methods, which made it unusable for anyone but him. If the emperor was absent or off form, then the system began to fail, and any mistakes that he made were rarely corrected by a staff so used to simply obeying. However, for all its potential drawbacks, when Napoleon was on form, then the system could operate at speeds that its enemies could merely dream of. Great ideas became decisive actions with very little downtime between them. Finally, when it is remembered that the mind conceiving these strategical ideas belonged to a man who thoroughly understood the art of war, and whose tool for conducting it was the Grande Armée, a motivated force filled with competent officers and well-trained men, it is easy to understand how they saw so much success. Until next time, thanks for watching.